Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up in the Top Kappa Palace harem. The good news? You're surrounded by silk, satin, and scented rosewater. The bad news? You're also surrounded by 200 other concubines, all of whom may or may not want to outshine you, out-scheme you, or in some cases outlive you. You blink awake on a cushioned divan that looks like it was hand-stitched by blind angels using golden thread, because it probably was. You think this would feel luxurious. It doesn't. It feels like pressure, constant velvety pressure. A bell rings not for prayer. But for grooming, you have exactly 10 minutes to prepare your face to look naturally flawless, which is Ottoman for painting it like a Renaissance oil painting and smiling like you enjoy it. There's rose oil for the skin, crushed pearls for your cheeks, and enough kohl eyeliner to write a love letter across your eyelids. Mascara, invented by disappointment and applied with a twig. Privacy, never heard of her. You share your chamber with women who may love you like sisters or plot your downfall like middle management villains. Gossip travels faster than letters. Alliances form over pomegranate seeds. Betrayals begin with a hairpin left in the wrong place. And the scent. Imagine a jasmine-scented fog bank mixed with anxiety, incense, and the eternal hope of catching the Sultan's eye. If Chanel ever released a perfume called Ambition and Claustrophobia, this would be it. Your eyes smooth your embroidered caftan, hand-washed by a servant girl who's 12 but somehow already hates you, and head toward morning roll call, where senior eunuchs decide which concubines get summoned to the Sultan's attention. It's like a beauty pageant, except the prize is existential terror. No, you can't leave. Yes, someone is always watching, and your survival hinges on remaining fascinating, fragrant, and fertile. Welcome to your day in the Ottoman Imperial Harem, where your first waking breath is power play, your smile is strategy, and your bed is softer than freedom. And it only gets weirder from here. Welcome to the Hammam, the steam-filled spa where imperial politics happen naked. You might assume the bathhouse is for hygiene, and technically you'd be right. But here in the harem, it's also where alliances form, rivalries simmer. Along with your paws, and everything smells faintly of lavender, lemons, and passive aggression. The concubines file and like graceful ghosts wrapped in embroidered silk towels. You do the same, pretending this isn't the most intimidating nudity you've ever experienced. The senior women float through the marble chamber like swans, dangerous territorial swans with better skin than you'll ever have. Attendants scrub you down with what feels like love, but is actually a loofah soaked in vengeance. Your skin tingles. Your dignity retreats. You try not to make eye contact while being exfoliated within an inch of your past life. You learn quickly. The bath is more than a bath. It's a surveillance chamber in disguise. Everyone's watching. Not openly, but subtly. Who is sitting with whom? Who's whispering? Who's laughing a little too hard at the Valid Sultan's niece's joke? You don't speak much because you're new. Speaking too soon in a hammam is like trying to open a chess match by flipping the board. The veterans will either ignore you or quietly decide you need correcting, usually in the form of chore reassignment or social exile. That being said, the hammam is your first glimpse of the harem's soft power. You hear tales, always half-whispered, of women who rose not just by catching the Sultan's eye, but by knowing the right bath attendant, the right older concubine, the right story to share at the right steamy moment. It's also the only place in the palace where secrets accidentally fall out, usually between splashes of water and scented soaps. You learn which concubines are favored, which ones haven't been summoned in months, which eunuch allegedly dropped a love note. Scandalous. All this, overheard while someone is scrubbing your elbows like they're angry at them. You leave the hammam pink, polished, and 12% more paranoid than when you entered. Congratulations. Your skin is radiant. Your mind permanently fogged by heat, jasmine, and the politics of proximity. If you thought the harem was all silk pillows and flutes playing in the distance. Adorable. Really. But by now you've learned it's less of a day spar and more of a slow-motion chess match where the pieces are beautiful, boring, and dangerously well-informed. And then there are the eunuchs, specifically the black eunuchs, high-ranking castrated guards who report directly to the Valid Sultan. They control who goes in and out of the harem, who gets summoned, who gets ignored, and occasionally who disappears without a trace and is never spoken of again. They don't smile much. They don't need to. Their presence alone is a career-ending gesture. You quickly learn. If you want to survive, better yet thrive, you don't flatter the Sultan. You befriend the eunuchs. Not with gifts. That's suspicious. Not with flirting, deeply awkward and wildly inappropriate. No, the trick is to be respectful, predictable, and above all, inoffensively useful. You ask for nothing. You're always ready when summoned. You never ever gossip about them, because news travels in this palace faster than plague, and you really don't want your name attached to a sentence that ends in, "And then she was transferred to the laundry chamber." Meanwhile, among the concubines, relationships are complicated. You've made one tentative friend, a girl from Circassia, who pretends to like embroidery, but is clearly plotting something long-term and ruthless. You also have an enemy, though you're not sure why. She stared at you too long during lute practice. You blinked. She hasn't spoken to you since. Everything is subtle. Compliments are weapons. Smiles are loaded. You begin to miss the emotional simplicity of your old village goat. But you learn. You learn how to interpret silence, how to stand just close enough to power without looking ambitious, how to thank a eunuch for handing you a letter as if he just handed you a divine scroll. And most of all, you learn that survival here isn't about being the prettiest or the most talented. It's about understanding how power moves in glances, in silence, in the way someone's name is spoken one day and not the next. At first glance, your job as a concubine seems simple. It looks beautiful. Smile politely, and waft through the palace like an emotionally available ghost in silk slippers. But in reality, you're now expected to master the oldest imperial skill of them all, absorbing everything while appearing to absorb nothing. You are a sponge, a bejeweled, perfumed sponge who embroiders a suspicious number of tulips while memorizing who sits where, who glares at whom, and who got an extra apricot at breakfast. Subtle changes in fruit distribution. In this palace, it's practically a coup. Your daily schedule now includes hours of training that sounds like finishing school, but smells like political grooming. You're taught music, literature, poetry, Islamic law, Ottoman etiquette, and if you're lucky, how not to pass out during dance lessons. The idea is to be beautiful, yes, but also charmingly clever without being threatening. Like a decorative peacock that can quote Rumi and doesn't talk back. The real education, though, happens in between. You learn to notice how long it takes the Valid Sultan's tray to be cleared and who clears it. You know which eunuch walks in just before bad news arrives. You memorize who's absent. You never ask why. You listen more than you speak. Actually, you don't speak unless someone 3 ranks above you asks you to. Even then, you keep it brief, ideally with a comment that's humble, insightful, and somehow flattering to them without sounding like you're trying. And while you sit there with your hands neatly folded over your embroidery, which may or may not be a misshapen dove, you are quietly archiving every interaction in your mental scroll. Alliances, slights, opportunities, names, especially names. You also begin to understand the unspoken ranking system. Who is favored? Who is tolerated? Who is 3 skipped meals away from being reassigned to kitchen duty? You are currently somewhere between interesting newcomer and acceptable wall furnishing. Don't worry, that's better than it sounds. Because the truth is, in the Ottoman harem, looking harmless is one of the most dangerous things you can do, and you're starting to do it quite well. There are 2 kinds of fear in the harem: the fear of being overlooked, and the fear of being noticed. Today you are flirting dangerously with the second. It begins innocently. You are handed a new robe. Not the usual subtle gray blue cotton you've worn for weeks, but something far too bold. Silk, rose-colored, embroidered with tiny golden vines. You stare at it like it just proposed to you from the Valid Sultan's steward. The servant girl mutters, eyes down. This could mean anything. Maybe you're being rewarded. Maybe you're being tested. Maybe it was meant for another concubine, and you're now walking into someone else's assassination plot with very soft sleeves. You put it on. It fits suspiciously well. As you pass through the harem corridors, the other women notice not openly. That would be beneath them, but with precisely timed pauses in conversation, raised brows, and one glance so sharp it could cut embroidery thread. You sit for morning recitation with your posture a little straighter. You pretend not to notice that you've been placed slightly closer to the front. Not directly next to the favored ones, but not with the wallpaper girls either. Then there's the rose. Later that afternoon, Eunuch delivers a single pink rose to your quarters. Just one. No message, no explanation. You hold it like it might detonate. In palace code, this could mean anything. The Sultan might have noticed you, or someone wants it to look that way. Or maybe you're being set up for palace gossip, the deadliest game of telephone in Ottoman history. The safest move. You press the rose between the pages of your prayer book and tell absolutely no one. Not even your shadow. Especially not your shadow. Cheap gossips. You go to bed that night, draped in rose silk. Feeling like a target inside a Valentine's Day card here in a harem, rising too quickly is suspicious. Standing out is dangerous, but disappearing, that's worse. So you hold your posture, sip your sherbet, and prepare for whatever this robe and rose combination means. Because it might be everything, or it might be nothing. And in this place, both are equally terrifying. Dinner in the harem isn't dinner. It's theater. Competitive, highly seasoned theater where everyone wears silk and pretends they're not sizing up their enemies between bites of stewed lamb. You enter the great dining chamber and take your seat. Not too close to the center. You haven't earned that and not too far in the shadows. You're not invisible yet. The seating arrangement is an ever-shifting map of status. 1 week you're near the lute player who knows everyone's secrets the next. You're next to a woman who hasn't spoken since 1572. The food arrives on trays carried by silent eunuchs. Bowls of saffron rice, pomegranate-studded pilaf, grape leaves, sweet sherbets in crystal glasses, all of it delicate, flavorful, and somehow emotionally threatening. No one rushes. That would be vulgar. You nibble slowly, gracefully, like someone who doesn't even really need food because she is nourished by poetry and intrigue alone. Conversations are hushed. Nobody laughs too loud unless they're trying to send a message. I'm confident enough to be cheerful in this snake pit. You nod politely. You smile just enough. You do not, under any circumstance, ask for more bread. Hunger is a weakness. So is gluttony also. Someone might be watching to see if you take 2 figs. You catch eyes with another concubine across the table. She's new, or maybe she's old and reborn with a better tailor. Either way, her earrings are too large for her rank, and her smile is the kind that comes with long-term plans. You break eye contact before she decides you're a problem. Then comes the part no one ever admits, watching the eunuch enter. When he steps in, there shifts. If he heads your way, a letter, an invitation, anything, you remain perfectly calm on the outside. Internally, your soul may or may not be breakdancing. If he doesn't, you nod as if this suits you just fine. You didn't want to be summoned anyway. You're busy chewing suspiciously decorative grapes. By the end of dinner, nothing has happened. Everything has happened. Power has changed hands in eyebrow lifts and polite laughter. You rise, you bow, you leave. Still hungry, still smiling, still in the game. You try to sleep, which is adorable, because the harem at night is like a theater stage after the performance. Dim, hush, but still full of tension. The lanterns flicker low, the fountains murmur outside, and you lie awake wondering if tonight is the night a eunuch knocks on your door. You know the rules. The Sultan chooses in secret, sometimes with intent, sometimes impulsively, sometimes because he saw a girl drop a fig with particular elegance. There's no pattern, no logic, just anticipation and silk-robed anxiety around you. The other women pretend to sleep. One breathes too loudly, another keeps adjusting her veil, like it might protect her from bad news or good luck. Everyone's pretending not to care. You care. Of course you care. You were handed a rose 2 days ago, and you're still trying to decide if it was a compliment or a warning. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Palace communication is like poetry written by a committee of spies. Suddenly, soft footsteps. Door creaks. Somewhere, a eunuch whispers a name. Not yours. You exhale. Relief. Disappointment. A cocktail of both served in an emotional silver goblet. You roll over and close your eyes, only for your mind to start staging imaginary conversations with the Sultan in 3 different languages, all of which you're still learning. You dream, but not of home. That place is blurry now. You dream of the woman across the dining table with the earrings too large for her rank. She smiles at you in the dream. You wake up certain she wants you demoted, exiled, or at the very least, stuck in lute lessons for the rest of your natural life. You dab rosewater under your nose and pretend it's calming. It isn't, but it smells like control. At some point, just before dawn, you finally drift off. You've survived another night without being chosen, without being erased, without accidentally looking too eager or too dull. And in the palace of Top Kappa, that's not sleep. That's a diplomatic victory. There are 2 stories whispered in the harem. One is the fairy tale where the Sultan notices you and your life is transformed by luxury, influence, and the occasional diamond the size of a walnut. The other is what actually happens. The Sultan, ruler of an empire that stretches from Hungary to Arabia, may or may not remember your name. You are one of hundreds. He could have summoned you because you look like a painting he once saw, or because his coffee tasted a bit too bitter and he's in the mood for distraction. When the eunuch knocks on your door after nightfall, he doesn't explain. He just bows. You rise silently, heart pounding in your ears like a royal drumline. You are led through halls lit by lanterns and scented with sandalwood, a path hundreds have walked, but only a few have returned from with stories worth surviving. You arrive at a chamber where your reflection stares back from polished brass and tile mosaics. A final attendant adjusts your veil, adds one more drop of oil behind your ears, and gives you a look that says smile, but not too much. Speak, but only if spoken to. And for the love of Allah, don't trip. You enter, and there he is, the Sultan, the man you've trained for, feared, imagined, and maybe accidentally dreamed about during Quran lessons. He is wearing silk robes and an unreadable expression. He says your name, the new one, not the one your mother gave you. He asks where you're from. You lie gracefully. You talk about poetry. He nods. Then he hands you a fig. What does it mean? Everything in the harem is a metaphor, and this fruit is no different. Is it a test of refinement? An invitation? A subtle indication of dietary preference? You take the fig, peel it gently, and offer a reply that sounds both elegant and mysterious. Something about sweet things hiding bitterness. You hope it sounds deep. It might just sound hungry. The night passes in conversation, music, and the occasional silence that feels like a judgment. When you are dismissed, it's with a nod. You are escorted back, alone, intact, and thoroughly bewildered. You have been noticed, and now things are about to get complicated. You return just before dawn, walking softer than usual, as if stepping too loudly might break whatever spell you were briefly under. You slept, sort of. More accurately, you reclined next to the most powerful man in the empire and tried very hard not to sweat through your perfume. You were charming, you think. You definitely said something about poetry. Or maybe goats. You're not sure anymore. The eunuchs say nothing when you pass. That's good. Silence is always preferable to a knowing smirk. Back in the harem, the air smells different. Same jasmine incense. Same rose oil in the hallway, but now it's seasoned with something new. Attention. The concubines don't look at you directly. That would be crass, but you feel their glances bounce off your shoulders like decorative daggers. At breakfast, your seating has changed a little closer to the center. Not too obvious, but enough to say she might be relevant now. Your sherbet is slightly colder than everyone else's. It's the little luxuries that reveal everything. You're still you, still technically low in rank, still expected to attend lessons, still responsible for folding far too many embroidered towels. But now you're under surveillance. Not by the palace guards, by everyone else. Girls who never spoke to you before suddenly want to share their favorite verses from Persian poetry. A servant accidentally leaves a pomegranate on your tray, a fruit associated with fertility, which is about as subtle as dropping a baby cradle in your lap. Even your enemies become more polite. They nod slightly. Their eyes, however, remain sharp and amused, like cats watching a candle. The older concubines offer no expression at all. They've seen this before. Some of them were you 5 years ago. One or two still might be. You spend the rest of the day doing what the harem trains you to do best, appearing neutral. You speak when addressed. You smile just enough. You move like you belong here, because now you sort of do. But the real trick, not letting anyone know how you feel, because in this palace, emotion is a currency, and yours is under heavy exchange. You've stepped onto the palace ladder now, the one no one talks about, but everyone's scrambling up in their softest slippers. It doesn't lean against a wall. It floats, shifts, and sometimes snaps in half under the weight of ambition. The first step? Survive the attention. Your name, your new government-issued Ottoman name, is whispered more often now. Not loudly, of course, just enough that you begin to feel like a character in someone else's play. One day, you're complimented on your embroidery by a concubine who previously thought you were part of the furniture. Next, you're offered fig paste by someone who'd rather poison you than promote your breakfast. You decline politely. You've also been reassigned to a new chamber. It has 2 extra cushions, better lighting, and a mirror that doesn't distort your face into a medieval fresco. That's not generosity. That's a signal. You're rising slowly, like steam in a hammer. Visible, fleeting, and occasionally scalding. And so begins the dangerous balancing act known as strategic modesty. If you act too pleased, you're arrogant. If you act too humble, you're manipulative. If you trip on your robes and face plant into the prayer mat, okay, that's just unfortunate, but they'll still talk about it. The Valite Sultan, the mother of the Sultan and CEO of all that glitters, starts to notice you. Not directly, of course, but her steward now nods at you in a hallway. That's basically an endorsement or a warning. Possibly both. Meanwhile, your peers begin dividing into categories. The friendly opportunists, the silent threats, and one terrifying girl who seems to live entirely on melon and revenge. You learn to navigate them all. With smiles that say, I respect you, and eyes that whisper, but I will absolutely outlive you. Pearls appear on your caftan one morning, small ones at the collar, a gift or a test, just pearls. You wear them carefully, like armor with excellent luster. Every gesture matters now. How you walk, how you bow, how long you hold someone's gaze. This isn't flirtation. This is diplomacy. In slippers, you're climbing gently, carefully. And if you fall, the floor is paved with other girls who once had pearls too. There are moments in palace life that make your pulse trip over itself. Being summoned by the Sultan is one. Being noticed by the Valid Sultan, that's a different league entirely. She doesn't just run the harem. She is the harem architect of alliances, keeper of traditions, benevolent grandmother. One moment, political thunderstorm the next. And today she looks at you. Not a passing glance, not a polite acknowledgement. A full, direct, measured look. The kind of look that suggests she knows where you came from, where you're going, and how you chew your melon slices. You respond the only acceptable way. You panic internally, externally. You bow with mechanical precision, lower your gaze just enough to show respect but not subservience, and immediately begin questioning every outfit you've worn in the past month. Later, a steward arrives with a message. You are invited to assist with one of the Valid's charitable sewing projects. Translation. She wants to observe you in a room full of older, sharper women who can detect ambition at 500 paces. You arrive on time. Not too early. That's desperate. Not too late. That's suicidal. She sits surrounded by cushions, embroidery, hoops, and the kind of silence that dares you to speak first. You don't. You thread a needle and pretend this doesn't feel like a job interview disguised as domestic servitude. The other women chat politely. Velida listens. Occasionally, she asks a question. Where were you educated? What's your favorite surah? Have you ever met anyone who truly understands politics? You answer carefully, gracefully, as if your entire future depends on it. Because it does. At one point, she smiles. Not at you, near you, which is basically the same thing. When it's over, you bow again and exit with the calm of someone who has no idea whether they've just been promoted or marked for reassignment to towel duty. Back in your chamber, your roommate stares at you like you've just returned from riding a dragon. She looked at you, she whispered. You nod, smiling faintly. You don't say it aloud, but yes, and you're still sweating. There's a knock at your chamber door. Not the gentle knock of a friend, but the impatient tap of a eunuch carrying towels. This one is deliberate, the kind of knock that comes with consequences. A message is handed to you. You are invited to a private tea by one of the Sultan's favored consorts. Her name is whispered through the harem like a lullaby sung with a knife in it. She is powerful, poised, and depending on who you ask, either your best chance at survival, or the reason girls disappear mysteriously during lunch. You accept. Of course you do, because saying no in the harem is about as effective as throwing a fig at a cavalry charge. You dress with mathematical care, not too extravagant. She might think you're challenging her. Not too plain. She might think you're insulting her. You settle on elegance with plausible humility and add a hairpin that says I'm competent, but not plotting it yet. The tea room is small, perfumed, and intimidatingly silent. She sits alone, reclining like someone who invented reclining. Her robe is embroidered with threads that probably cost more than your hometown. She gestures for you to sit. You do gracefully, quietly, with just enough bow to imply deference, but not desperation. She pours the tea herself. That's very generous. Or very symbolic, possibly both. What follows is a masterclass in veiled threats and indirect compliments. She tells you she's heard you've caught the attention of some influential eyes. She says it like you've accidentally adopted a stray panther. She smiles when you respond. You do not know if she likes your answer or if she's marking you for later. You talk of poetry, music, and carefully palace routines. She nods often. Occasionally, she glances at the door, as if calculating whether you're worth her time or just another chapter in her scrapbook of rising starlets. After the second cup, she dismisses you with a smile that could launch or sink a career. You return to your chamber, exhausted and slightly unsure whether you've been recruited, warned, or subtly claimed. Either way, someone very important now knows your name, and that is both your greatest asset and your newest liability. By now, you've learned that words in the harem are like spices, used sparingly and always with purpose. Say too much and you're exposed. Say too little and you're forgotten. But if you say just enough and let silence do the rest, that's when you become dangerous. Today's lesson begins in the music chamber, where a group of senior concubines gathers to discuss poetry, philosophy, and, let's be honest, each other. You are invited to sit in, not speak, sit. A test disguised as hospitality. You arrive on time, offer the required courtesies, and fold yourself neatly into the corner like a well-mannered napkin. You sip your sherbet. You nod occasionally. You look interested, but not eager. You laugh softly at one joke, just enough to seem human. And then it happens. One of the elderly women turns to you and asks a question. Not a trap. Not yet. Just a simple inquiry about your thoughts on a Rumi verse. But you know what this is. They're not testing your taste in poetry. They're testing your timing. You pause long enough to seem thoughtful. Not so long that it looks like you're scrambling for a safe answer. Then you say something that sounds reflective, reverent, and above all vague. They nod. They are satisfied. You've passed. Later you are asked again, this time about the Valid Sultan's new charitable initiative. You say nothing critical. You compliment the elegance of the idea without claiming to understand the politics behind it. You use words like humbling and visionary. You are playing verbal chess with invisible queens. The truth is, most power in the harem is held in silence. In the glance that lingers, in the smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, in the pause before someone replies, where everyone leans in just slightly to see which direction the wind is blowing, you leave that room, having said less than a dozen sentences, and somehow your name is on 3 more lips than it was yesterday. You're not just surviving now, you're learning to glide wordlessly, precisely, and beautifully. Through a world where stillness speaks louder than declarations and the walls, they're still listening. You find a gift on your pillow. No note, no signature, just a small velvet box tied with a ribbon the color of dried rose petals and possibly veiled judgment. You open it slowly as one opens anything in the harem, halfway expecting perfume, halfway expecting scorpions. It's jewelry, a delicate bracelet inlaid with turquoise and gold filigree. Beautiful, elegant, alarming, because nothing here is ever just a gift. You scan the room. Your roommate raises an eyebrow. She does not ask questions. She's either very polite or very invested in plausible deniability. The bracelet is undoubtedly expensive. Too expensive for a casual trinket, not quite royal enough to be from the Sultan. Which narrows it down to someone wealthy, calculating, and interested in controlling the narrative. Or you. You wear it. Of course you do. That's the game. By mid-morning, the rumors begin. She received a gift, someone whispered at the fountain. From whom? Someone else replies. She didn't say, comes the answer, which in this place is the same as saying everyone should assume the worst or most interesting option. You maintain your expression, a calm mix of modesty, confusion, and mild boredom. Meanwhile, your internal monologue is doing cartwheels through every past conversation, searching for enemies, allies, and anyone with a taste for turquoise. By lunchtime, the gossip had mutated. You've allegedly received a secret message, a hidden proposal, and an heirloom passed down from the Valent Sultan herself. All untrue. All dangerously believable. Then comes the whispered warning. A servant girl, low-ranked, easily ignored, drops your tray and mutters, "Careful who puts things in your hand when they can't say it to your face." You thank her because that's what you do when someone warns you indirectly of possible sabotage while pretending to be clumsy. You keep the bracelet on, but you sleep with it tucked under your pillow, just in case. In the harem, a gift is rarely a gesture of affection. It's a test, a leash, a label, or a gentle reminder that your name is being spoken in rooms you haven't entered yet. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can wear is not a smile, but proof that someone wants to claim you. One morning, just before the call to prayer, you're summoned not by a eunuch, not by a servant, but by a letter sealed in the imperial blue wax, delivered with no explanation. Just a glance that suggests everything is about to change. You sit alone as you read it. The script is elegant. The offer is clear. You are to be elevated. Moved to more private quarters, closer to the Sultan, closer to the core of the palace, and further from anonymity. It is on paper a promotion. But here in the harem, a promotion is just a prettier word for exposure. Accept, and you step into the world of real influence. Politics, intrigue, the possibility of bearing a royal child, of becoming a consort, maybe even the Sultan's favorite. It's what some women dream of. It's also where women vanish. You have until sunset to reply. So you walk the gardens, the ones where you used to hide in the shadow of elder concubines. Now they look smaller. The fountains still whisper. The tulips still bloom like delicate secrets, but the air feels different. It's your name they speak now. You think of home blurry now. You think of the other girls, the ones who never rose, the ones who rose too fast, the ones who were clever but not clever enough. And you think of yourself, not the version trained in etiquette and poetry, but the girl who arrived with her old name tucked somewhere between her ribs. That night you dress carefully. One final choice. You walk past the curtains, the silken borders that separate the known from the unknown. And in the stillness you answer. Maybe you rise. Maybe you vanish. Maybe your name is written into palace history. Or maybe it's whispered one last time and folded away like a silk scarf in a drawer no one opens anymore. But one thing is certain. You are not just a decoration. You are a strategist in satin. A survivor in perfume, a masterclass in restraint. And for one full day, and maybe longer, you walk the tightrope between power and peril without falling. Long before comic books and Hollywood blockbusters, the ancient world already had its own Amazons, and they were terrifyingly real. Meet the Scythian women, horse-riding, bow-wielding warriors of the Eurasian steppe who didn't justify gender norms. They reloaded and galloped right over them. The Scythians were a nomadic people who roamed what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and parts of Central Asia. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote of fierce Amazon women who mated with Scythian men and birthed a tribe of warriors. For centuries, scholars chalked that up to Greek imagination and a little too much wine. But recent archaeology tells a different story, one with bone-deep proof. Excavations of Scythian burial mounds or kurgans have uncovered the remains of women buried with full warrior regalia, swords, spears, quivers of arrows, and even battle scars. One teenager's skeleton, discovered in the Altai region, had arrowheads embedded in her spine, a grim but undeniable sign that she fought and died in combat. Some were laid to rest with their horses clad in armor. These weren't ceremonial props. They were used and worn. This was a culture that didn't just allow women to fight. It expected them to. Scythian society, unlike most of its ancient contemporaries, wasn't rigidly patriarchal. While men raided and hunted, women often did the same. Girls were trained from a young age to ride and shoot, and elite females could hold positions of influence. There are even signs that Scythian priestesses held spiritual authority, making them both feared in battle and revered in ritual. The Greeks were both fascinated and horrified. They created the myth of the Amazons, wild warrior women who hated men and lived apart from civilization. But the core of the legend was grounded in their encounters with the Scythians. These women didn't match the submissive domestic ideal of the Greek woman. They were aliens, powerful and therefore mythologized. So next time someone says female warriors are just a fantasy trope, remind them the Scythians beat us to it by about 2,500 years, and their legacy is written not in legend, but in arrow-pierced skeletons and iron-tipped truths buried beneath the steppe. If you think battlefield leadership was strictly a man's game, then you haven't met the queens of Africa. These weren't pampered palace figures lounging in silk. These were war-hardened rulers who led armies, negotiated treaties, and stared down empires without flinching. And they didn't just participate in warfare, they redefined it. Take Queen Amanirenas of Kush, for example. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire, fresh from annexing Egypt, made the tactical error of trying to extend its grip further south into Nubia. Amanirenas, a one-eyed queen who had already fought in battle, had other plans. She rallied her people, launched a series of counterattacks, and even captured Roman forts. One statue of Augustus. She had it decapitated and buried under her temple steps. A deliciously unsubtle message. Eventually, Rome backed off and negotiated peace. That's right, one of the most powerful empires in history was forced to make nice with an one-eyed warrior queen, and she wasn't alone. Across Africa, female leaders often doubled as military commanders. In the 16th century, Queen Amina of Zazzau, in what is now Nigeria, led cavalry raids across Hausa lands. According to oral tradition, she expanded her territory further than any ruler before or after her. Amina built walls around cities, developed trade routes, and more importantly, never let her gender limit her battlefield authority. Her soldiers respected her not just because she was queen, but because she could probably outfight most of them. Further south, the kingdom of Dahomey was protected by the Igoji, an all-female military regiment the French later nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons. These were not symbolic guards. They were frontline fighters, trained from childhood in weaponry, endurance, and discipline. They served as elite royal protectors and often led charges in battle. Some accounts even describe them as more aggressive than their male counterparts, possibly because they had more to prove, or maybe because they just enjoyed the job. These women weren't rare exceptions. In many African societies, women were expected to be capable politically, economically, and militarily. They negotiated with colonizers, resisted conquest, and commanded troops. Their existence wasn't radical. It was cultural. So the next time someone says history was written by men with swords, you might want to add sure, but some of those swords were held by queens. When you picture ancient Greece or Rome at war, it's usually rows of male soldiers in bronze armor marching off to battle. But stay behind the front lines and you'll find a different kind of warrior, one who didn't wear a tunic into combat but picked up a weapon when the city gates were about to fall. Women in both Greek and Roman societies were often forced into defensive roles. and they didn't hesitate to rise to the occasion. In classical Athens, women were officially excluded from military service. Their roles were mostly domestic, religious, or symbolic. But when invaders came knocking, those lines blurred fast. During the Persian Wars, for example, Greek women acted as logistical support, running supplies, caring for the wounded, and in some desperate cases, throwing roof tiles from the city walls onto enemy troops. Not exactly the glamorous side of battle, but it made a difference. The siege of Plataea in 429 BCE offers one striking moment. Women trapped inside the city took up arms, fought alongside the remaining defenders, and, according to Thucydides, played a vital role in the resistance. These weren't trained soldiers. They were citizens turned fighters. But war doesn't always wait for training. Over in Rome, women were technically barred from military engagement, and yet Roman history is littered with tales of women taking charge when things fell apart. In the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE, women reportedly negotiated with the invaders, offered their jewelry to fund defense efforts, and helped rally morale during later conflicts like the Second Punic War. Roman women often followed their husbands to military camps, some even acting as informal strategists or advisors. One particularly notable tale comes from the sack of Rome in 410 CE. As Alaric's Visigoths stormed the city, noble women like Proba and others are said to have opened their estates as places of refuge, armed their servants, and coordinated resistance within the urban chaos. These weren't passive victims. They were active participants in defense and survival. In the ancient world, warfare wasn't just fought with swords on a battlefield. It was fought with quick thinking, courage, and sometimes sheer desperation. And women were right there in the thick of it, defending their homes when no one else could. If you were a Roman governor in Britannia around 60 CE, your worst nightmare had a name, and it was Boudica. She wasn't just a queen. She was a force of vengeance, fire, and fury. With a knack for rallying an entire population of angry Britons into open revolt against the world's most powerful empire, Boudica ruled the Orsini tribe in eastern Britain. After her husband, King Prasutagus, died, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman Empire, an attempt to secure peace. Rome, being Rome, ignored the will, annexed the territory outright, publicly flogged Boudica and, in an act so horrific it's still discussed today, had her daughters assaulted. This wasn't just political domination, it was humiliation, and Boudica would not let that stand. What followed wasn't a minor rebellion, it was an all-out war. Boudica became the face of the uprising, leading a coalition of tribes in a scorched earth campaign that shook Roman control to its core. First stop, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, a Roman town that was utterly razed. Then Londinium, modern-day London, burned to ash. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, same fate. The Roman historian Cassius Dio described her as tall, terrifying, with a mane of red hair and a fierce presence that stirred her warriors into a frenzy. Tacitus, meanwhile, emphasized her eloquence and leadership, describing how she addressed her troops not as a nobleman, but as a mother, wronged, and a warrior awakened. Though she had early victories, Boudica's army eventually faced a professional Roman force under Governor Suetonius Paulinus. Outnumbered and poorly equipped, the rebels were slaughtered. Boudica either took poison or fell in battle. The sources disagree, but her defeat didn't erase her impact. The Romans learned their lesson. They became more cautious in how they dealt with tribal leaders, and they never forgot the name of the woman who made an empire tremble. Boudica's rebellion wasn't just an uprising. It was a reminder that oppressed people, led by someone with nothing left to lose, can become the most dangerous force of all. And in this case, that force happened to be a mother with a war chariot and a long memory. In the lore of feudal Japan, the image of the samurai is almost always male. The stoic warrior in lacquered armor, loyal to death, sword in hand. But look beyond the cherry blossoms and Bushido scrolls, and you'll find another kind of samurai, one in silk and steel. The Onaba Geisha, or women warriors, were not only real, they were deadly. Trained in martial arts, archery, and strategy, these noble women were the hidden backbone of many samurai clans. They weren't typically sent into open field battles like their male counterparts, but when their homes, castles, or family honor were at stake, They fought without hesitation and often without mercy. One of the most iconic honor-be geisha was Tomo Guzan, a 12th century warrior who fought during the Genpei War. Described in the Heike Monogatari, Japan's epic of war and honor, Tomo was said to be a peerless rider and remarkable archer who could cut down men with one sweep of her katana. She rode into battle like a tempest, wearing full armor, long black hair trailing behind her like a war banner. At the Battle of Yuwazu, she reportedly decapitated a rival samurai in single combat, a final blaze of glory before disappearing from history like a ghost on horseback. Then there's Nakano Takiko, a 19th century fighter during the Boshin War. She wasn't formally part of the imperial army. Women weren't allowed, so she formed her own unit, an unofficial corps of female warriors who fought with naginata pole weapons. She died leading a charge against imperial forces, taking a bullet to the chest. Her last request was to be buried with honor by her sister, so the enemy wouldn't claim her body. These women weren't tokens or legends. They were part of the martial tradition, upholding the values of Bushido, loyalty, bravery, and self-sacrifice. Some even received the same training as their male counterparts in times of war. Of course, as Japan modernized and centralized its military power, the honor-be geisha were pushed to the margins, their stories reduced to folklore. But the reality remains. In Japan's blood-soaked history of samurai clashes and castle sieges, women's blades were sharpened just as often and just as deadly. The Roman Colosseum, a monument to cruelty, entertainment, and testosterone-fueled violence. Lions, spears, slaves, and sweaty men locked in mortal combat. But what if we told you that sometimes the combatants weren't just men? That buried beneath the mythos of the Roman gladiator is the lesser-known reality of female gladiators, the gladiatrices. While they were rare, these women did exist, and they weren't there to serve snacks. They fought in front of roaring crowds, trained in the same bloody gladiator schools, and were often treated with both titillation and terror. Roman emperors, especially the more theatrically inclined like Nero and Domitian, loved the shock value of women in combat. Female gladiators were novelties, yes, but also formidable warriors in their own right. Evidence is scattered but compelling. A marble relief from Halicarnassus shows two women, Amazon and Achillea, locked in combat. The carving even notes that they fought to a draw, which was considered an honorable outcome. Their names weren't randomly assigned either. They evoked mythic female warriors, framing these women not as weak imitators, but as ferocious equals. Literary sources also mention them. Satirist Juvenal, never one to miss an opportunity to judge, mocked upper-class women who trained as gladiators, suggesting it was a scandalous rejection of femininity. Others, like Suetonius, note that female fighters sometimes appeared in nighttime spectacles, lit by torches and fueled by wine-soaked crowds who weren't exactly there for a thoughtful display of martial skill. But training was real, and the danger wasn't staged. These women fought with swords, tridents, and nets, just like male gladiators, and they bled just as much. They were often slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to the arena. Some were volunteers, octorati, who chose the life of a gladiator for fame, money, or escape from worse fates. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus banned women from gladiator combat altogether, perhaps worried that Rome's taste for female fighters was becoming a bit too unorthodox, or perhaps because women were proving too good at it. So while they didn't dominate the Colosseum, the gladiatrices carved out a brutal, blood-stained space of their own. In the sand, gender meant little. Skill, ferocity, and survival meant everything. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a boys' club with chainmail. While most women were kept far from formal combat roles, some didn't get the memo or ignored it on purpose. Whether disguising themselves as men, leading troops as abbesses, or simply refusing to stay in the convent when swords started swinging, medieval women found ways to fight, both literally and symbolically. One of the strangest categories of warrior women, the warrior nuns. During the Crusades, certain religious women did more than pray for victory. They picked up weapons. While most did so defensively, records exist of abbesses and nuns taking command when their convents or lands were threatened. In the 12th century, the abbess of Quedlinburg was a spiritual leader and a military one, commanding vassals in battle as the head of a powerful religious territory. She didn't wear armor, but she sure gave orders like a general. Then there were women who simply became men, at least on paper. Medieval records reveal multiple cases of women disguising themselves in male clothing to enlist in armies. Some were caught and executed, others passed undetected for years. One example is the story of a woman known only as John, who served in an English garrison during the Hundred Years' War. When discovered, her comrades reportedly shrugged and let her continue because she fought just as hard as they did. Joan of Arc, of course, is the superstar of this category. The teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions, dressed in men's armor, and led the French army to victories that stunned Europe. But for every Joan, there were dozens of unnamed women who didn't have visions or sainthood, just grit and opportunity. Even outside of the battlefield, women played tactical roles. Noble women in besieged castles often coordinated defenses, rationed supplies, and negotiated with enemy forces. Eleanor of Aquitaine, while not a sword-swinging warrior, accompanied her husband on crusade and was rumored to have worn armor. Whether as a statement, protection, or performance is still debated. The point: the Middle Ages weren't nearly as monolithic as they seem. Women found loopholes in rigid systems, snuck past the rules, or simply made up new ones. And while history didn't always record their names, it certainly felt their presence on the battlefield. When people think of the medieval Islamic world, they might imagine flowing robes, caliphs in grand courts, or scholars debating science and philosophy. What do they often miss? The women who picked up swords, led armies, and defended cities when men were too slow, too dead, or too distracted by politics. Take Khawla bint al-Azwar, for example. A name that still echoes through Arab folklore like a war cry. A 7th century warrior during the early Muslim conquests, she fought alongside her brother in battle. After he was captured by Byzantine forces, she stormed the enemy lines in black armor, wielding her sword with such precision that soldiers mistook her for Khalid ibn al-Walid, the famed general known as the Sword of Allah. When her identity was revealed, morale didn't drop, it soared. She had earned her place among warriors through sheer skill and nerve. Women like Khawla weren't just battlefield anomalies. In times of crisis, especially during sieges, women took up arms to defend their homes and cities. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, as the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled, there are accounts of women fighting in the streets of Nishapur and other cities, flinging stones, wielding daggers, and turning their homes into fortresses. They were never formally trained, but desperation is a powerful teacher. Further in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, noble women weren't cloistered either. Some wielded considerable political and military influence. Walida bint al-Mustakfi, while best known as a poet, lived in a world where women of her class often ran estates and defended them during civil unrest a few centuries later. During the Reconquista, Muslim women sometimes joined their husbands in defending the last strongholds of Granada. There's also Sayyidah al-Hurra, not a battlefield warrior, but a pirate queen. In the 16th century, she commanded fleets in the western Mediterranean, striking fear into European ships. Allied with the infamous Barbarossa of the Ottoman Navy, she was a political leader and naval commander, a double threat on sea and shore. In many Islamic societies, the ideal of modesty coexisted with the reality of necessity. When cities burned and armies failed, the veil came off and the sword came out. And in those moments, history remembered them, not as women who broke the rules, but as warriors who rewrote them. For centuries, history books told us that war was a man's domain. Men led, men fought, men died gloriously, while women waited and wept, or patched wounds in the background. But scratch the surface, and a different story bleeds through. A story of women who didn't wait to be invited to the fight. They crashed the battlefield, often with more guts than glory. From the Scythian horse archers who likely inspire the Amazon myth, to African queens who outmaneuvered empires, to women gladiators drawing blood in the sand, every continent has its tales of female warriors. Sometimes they were leaders born into power, like Queen Amina or Boudica. Sometimes they were commoners who stepped up when chaos left no other option, like the medieval cross-dressers or the women defending ancient cities from siege. What unites them isn't just courage, it's the refusal to be erased. The legacy of these women isn't measured by how many battles they won, but by how many rules they broke. They defied cultural norms, religious expectations, and political boundaries. They forced generals, emperors, and chroniclers to revise their assumptions. In many cases, that meant being deliberately written out of the record. After all, what empire wants to admit it was rattled by a woman with a spear? And yet, the traces remain, in bones buried with weapons, in poems, in scratched notes from historians who didn't know what to make of them, in oral traditions, songs, and temple murals. The stories survived. Not always intact, not always celebrated, but alive enough to inspire generations that followed. Modern military history has only recently begun to fully acknowledge the breadth of women's contributions to warfare. It's not about placing women above men in battle. It's about recognizing that they were always there, even when they were never supposed to be. So the next time someone calls women in war an exception, remind them. From the deserts of North Africa to the snowy steppes of Central Asia, from castle sieges to chariot charges, women weren't just part of the war story. They were the plot twist, the hidden edge, the blade history tried to sheath, but never could, because once a sword is drawn, it doesn't care who's holding it, only what they're willing to do with it. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121 CE in Rome, the very heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to the sands of Arabia. His full name at the time of birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came from a noble lineage with deep senatorial roots. In other words, he wasn't starting from scratch. His grandfather had been a consul, and his family was rich in both wealth and political connections. But young Marcus wasn't spoiled by luxury. Even as a child, he had a reputation for being unusually serious, quiet, and thoughtful. The sort of kid who probably skipped out on the toy swords and asked philosophical questions instead. The Emperor Hadrian took notice of this moody, deep-thinking child and saw in him something rare integrity. He nicknamed Marcus Verissimus, meaning most truthful, and marked him out for a future few could dream of when Hadrian's first choice of successor died unexpectedly. He adopted Antoninus Pius under one condition, that Antoninus would in turn adopt Marcus Aurelius as his heir. And just like that, Marcus was on a slow-moving, responsibility-laden conveyor belt toward absolute power. His education was nothing short of elite. Tutors drilled him in Greek and Latin literature, rhetoric, and philosophy. But while many young aristocrats treated their lessons like chores, Marcus embraced them with religious devotion, especially Stoicism. He read Epictetus and Seneca not as abstract theory, but as a moral compass. To him, philosophy wasn't an intellectual game. It was a manual for how to live. He started sleeping on a hard floor, wore simple clothing, and practiced fasting, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to toughen his soul. As the years passed, under the watchful mentorship of Antoninus Pius, Marcus learned not only governance, but patience. Antoninus ruled with calm efficiency for over 2 decades, and Marcus observed every move, every decision, like a student preparing for a final exam he knew would one day come. Unlike many heirs who lust for the crown, Marcus approached power like a duty he would never escape, one that demanded discipline, self-denial, and above all, moral clarity. In short, Rome wasn't getting a playboy prince. It was preparing to crown a philosopher king. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus Aurelius finally ascended to the throne. But true to form, he didn't seize it with triumphant fanfare. Instead, he immediately insisted that power be shared with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother. It was a political move drenched in humility. And also in practicality, Rome was too large, too complex, and frankly too on fire to be managed by a single man, even a philosopher. Lucius Verus was Marcus's opposite in almost every way. Where Marcus was stoic and disciplined, Verus loved luxury parties and gladiator games. Marcus studied philosophy by candlelight. Lucius hired chefs and actors. Still, the partnership worked better than expected. Mostly because Marcus stayed focused on governance while Lucius led the military. And it's not like Rome was short on military emergencies. Just months into their joint reign, Parthian Empire, Rome's eastern rival, decided it was time to start some drama. Lucius Verus led the campaign while Marcus oversaw resources and logistics. The war dragged on for several years but ended in Roman victory. So win-win, right? Well, not quite. The returning legions brought more than just glory. They carried disease. A mysterious plague, now believed to have been smallpox or measles, swept through the empire. The Antonine Plague would go on to kill an estimated 5 million people, including a large chunk of the Roman military. Cities withered, crops failed, panic spread. Just when things couldn't get worse, they did. Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier saw Rome's weakness and started to push hard against the borders. Rome was being hit from every direction. Disease, war, political unrest. Marcus, barely into his rule, was already knee-deep in catastrophe. Lucius Verus died in 169 CE, likely from the plague, leaving Marcus to govern alone, the weight of the world now fully his to carry. Most rulers would have crumbled. But Marcus, calm, meditative, unflinching, saw adversity not as chaos, but as a test, a fire to be endured, not avoided. He didn't whine. He didn't retreat. He turned to his stoic principles and faced Rome's unraveling fabric with quiet resolve. After all, for Marcus, being emperor wasn't about personal glory. It was about duty, no matter how much it hurt. By the early 170s CE, Marcus Aurelius had traded his senatorial toga for a soldier's cloak. The Germanic tribes, especially the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians, were pouring across the Danube frontier, emboldened by Rome's recent plague-weakened defenses. Marcus didn't delegate this crisis from a marble palace. He rode in, he set up camp, and he stayed there year after year, leading from the front lines like a general. Not a philosopher king. It was in these harsh frontier conditions, surrounded by mud, cold, disease, and constant danger, that Marcus penned with history's most quietly revolutionary text, Meditations. He didn't write it for publication, glory, or even his heirs. It was a private journal, a philosophical diary, in which he reminded himself how to remain moral, rational, and composed in a world gone mad. Where other emperors built triumphal arches, Marcus built an inner citadel. In one moment, he was inspecting fortifications or negotiating with tribal leaders. In the next, he was scribbling thoughts like you have power over your mind, not side events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That wasn't a campaign strategy. It was soul maintenance. The wars were brutal. The Germanic tribes were not pushovers. They knew the terrain, used guerrilla tactics, and were desperate. Yet Marcus pressed on, adapting Roman military tactics, reorganizing legions, and making hard choices, including granting slaves and non-Romans military roles in exchange for loyalty. Traditionalists grumbled, but Marcus didn't care. He needed bodies, not bloodlines. Despite constant pressure, Marcus refused to become cruel. While his generals urged scorched earth campaigns, he often opted for diplomacy. When cities were taken, he forbade unnecessary slaughter. When tribes surrendered, he offered them land and autonomy, not annihilation. Even on the battlefield, he clung to stoic principles, like a man clinging to a raft in a storm. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who valued tranquility more than glory had become one of Rome's most battle-worn emperors. Yet he bore it all with grim grace. He wasn't fighting for conquest or fame. He was fighting to protect a crumbling empire, and perhaps to test whether philosophy could survive in the mud and blood of real life. Spoiler: it could. While Marcus Aurelius commanded legions and dealt with border invasions, his most enduring legacy wasn't forged with a sword, but with a pen. Amid tense snow and the groans of wounded soldiers, Marcus began writing what we now call Meditations, a collection of deeply personal reflections on life, virtue, suffering, and death. He didn't write it to impress anyone. These weren't public declarations or propaganda. They were reminders to himself. Mental armor. Notes from a man desperately trying to stay humane while presiding over a world unraveling. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. That's not the voice of an emperor basking in glory. That's someone reminding himself to live with integrity, even when no one's watching. The text reveals a constant inner struggle. Marcus battled not just Germanic tribes, but his own impulses. Anger, pride, despair. In one passage, he reminds himself not to expect gratitude. In another, He muses that even emperors are forgotten dust. Soon you'll have forgotten all things, he writes. And soon all things will have forgotten you. Cheery stuff, unless you're a Stoic. Stoicism, after all, it wasn't about joy or control. It was about accepting reality, however brutal, and choosing virtue in every moment. For Marcus, that meant doing his job, showing up, leading justly, not losing his head when plagues and wars spun everything into chaos. He wasn't trying to escape suffering. He was trying to suffer well. Meditations was written in Greek, the intellectual language of the time, and filled with quotes from Epictetus and other Stoic sages. But it's also shockingly modern. Marcus worried about burnout. He advised himself to stay calm around difficult people. He reminded himself that fame is fleeting, pleasure is overrated, and death is natural. It's like the original self-help manual, minus the smiling influencer and affiliate link. What makes Meditations remarkable is its humanity. Here was the most powerful man in the known world, sitting by candlelight, trying to be decent and often doubting he was. He didn't preach perfection. He preached effort, the effort to be just, kind, rational, even when surrounded by disease, war, betrayal, and mortality. And that's why his words still resonate today, because Marcus didn't just rule Rome, he ruled himself. While Marcus Aurelius was busy managing invasions and maintaining inner peace through philosophy, his personal life was less than tranquil. He married Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, a political union, but one that, at least on paper, seemed affectionate. Together they had 13 children. 13. But ancient Rome wasn't kind to young lives. Only a handful survived past infancy. Marcus buried 8 of his own children. Just pause and imagine that a man who daily pondered impermanence in his writings had to live it over and over. While Meditations rarely names these personal losses directly, the tone's somber, resolute aching hints at grief barely held at bay. Stoicism didn't eliminate pain, it just gave him tools to bear it. Then there was the drama around Faustina. Roman historians, often more fond of gossip than facts, accused her of everything from infidelity to treason. Cassius Dio, in the notoriously salacious Historia Augusta, claimed she had affairs with gladiators, soldiers, and possibly plotted against Marcus. But Marcus never publicly condemned her. In fact, he honored her memory after her death in 175 CE with temples, coins, and statues. Either he didn't believe the rumors, or he chose forgiveness over scandal. But family tensions didn't end there. One surviving son, Commodus, was being groomed to rule. And let's just say, Commodus was not his father's son in temperament or philosophy. While Marcus was scribbling meditations on humility and restraint, young Commodus was reportedly more interested in extravagant displays, wrestling matches, and self-glorification. Still, Marcus clung to the Roman tradition of hereditary succession. Despite signs that Commodus might be a dangerous choice, Marcus refused to break with custom. He named Commodus co-emperor in 177 CE, a decision that would cast a long, dark shadow over his legacy. At home and abroad, the pressures mounted. Marcus rarely had a moment of peace, if not from external chaos, then from private heartbreak, but he never abandoned his duties. He continued issuing legal reforms, supporting philosophy, and stabilizing an empire beset on all sides by change and decay. Through it all, Marcus Aurelius remained composed, committed, and above all, human. A ruler who was constantly tested not just by the sword, but by the weight of love, loss, and legacy. As if plagues, invasions, and family tragedy weren't enough, Marcus Aurelius also had to contend with betrayal, the kind that cuts deepest when it comes from inside the tent. In 175 CE, a respected general named Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor. This wasn't some obscure provincial revolt. Cassius was the governor of Syria and a man Marcus had trusted with immense military authority. And it wasn't entirely his fault either. A false rumor had reached Cassius. Marcus was dead. Rather than verify the facts, Cassius moved fast. He accepted the imperial title, hoping to seize power before the Senate or other legions reacted. It was a classic case of Roman ambition, running faster than Roman news. The East braced for civil war, but Marcus, he didn't panic. He didn't scream betrayal. He simply began preparing for a march east, not for vengeance, but for reconciliation. Incredibly, Marcus even considered pardoning Cassius. He believed in clemency, and preserving unity above pride. His letters and thoughts show a man determined to prevent more bloodshed, even if it meant forgiving a man who tried to steal his crown. It was the ultimate stoic move, keeping calm not just in chaos, but in the face of personal insult. But Marcus never got the chance to demonstrate that mercy before he could reach the east. Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, likely fearful of what the emperor's arrival would mean for them. His head was sent to Marcus as a gift. Marcus reportedly wept. To Marcus, rebellion wasn't just a threat to Rome's authority. It was a tragedy. It symbolized the weakening fabric of imperial loyalty, the creeping instability that would eventually choke the empire in the wake of the rebellion. Marcus traveled through the eastern provinces, not with rage, but with ritual. He performed public ceremonies, reaffirmed loyalty, and ensured that no one, especially the soldiers, misunderstood his intentions. But the cracks in the empire were widening. The plague had hollowed out the population, the borders were still bleeding, and now even Rome's inner circle had begun to fracture. Marcus saw it all, and still believed in reason, in justice, in virtue. Even as Rome began to unravel at the seams, he tried to stitch it back together, one stoic breath at a time. As Marcus Aurelius approached the end of his life, he wasn't resting on laurels or reclining in a marble villa. He was once again on the frontier, knee-deep in military operations against the Germanic tribes along the Danube. Despite his age and deteriorating health, he returned to the battlefield because duty didn't retire, and neither did Marcus. The Marcomannic Wars had dragged on for years, draining Roman resources and morale. Marcus knew this wasn't just about territory, it was about survival. The Germanic tribes weren't raiding for sport. They were being pushed east by other migrating groups, part of a domino effect that would eventually lead to the fall of Rome centuries later. But in the 170s CE, Marcus was still doing everything he could to hold the line. He reorganized the frontier defenses, resettled refugee tribes as loyal Roman allies, and continued writing philosophical reflections between campaigns. In one eerie passage from Meditations, he reminded himself, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you." These weren't abstract musings. They were the thoughts of a man acutely aware that his end was near. In 180 CE, while stationed in present-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius fell seriously ill, likely from the same plague that had haunted his reign. According to sources, he summoned his son Commodus to his side and offered him advice. Whether philosophical, practical, or desperate is lost to history. What we do know, Marcus died shortly after on March 17, 180 CE, surrounded not by senators or scribes, but by soldiers. His death marked the end of what many historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It also marked the end of Rome's age of philosopher kings. Commodus would inherit the throne, and spoiler alert, he was no Marcus. Rome's decline wouldn't begin with a bang, but with the quiet closing of Marcus's eyes and the slow unraveling of his legacy. There was no triumphal parade, no grand final speech, just a dying emperor in a cold northern outpost, doing what he always did, enduring, reflecting, and fulfilling his role to the very end. Marcus didn't seek immortality through monuments. He sought it through character, and in that he succeeded. Marcus Aurelius had spent his life preaching moderation, discipline, and reason. So naturally, the gods handed him Commodus. When Marcus died in 180 CE, he left the empire in the hands of a 19-year-old who seemed less interested in stoic virtue and more in gladiatorial cosplay. Commodus liked to dress as Hercules, battle in the arena, and refer to himself as the Roman Hercules because humility clearly skipped a generation. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Under Commodus, Rome descended into decadence, paranoia, and administrative chaos. He alienated the Senate, indulged in lavish spectacles, and executed rivals on a whim. Where Marcus had treated power as a sacred burden, Commodus treated it like a reality show prize. Bread and circuses became the rule of the day, so the question has haunted historians ever since. Why did Marcus, the wise philosopher, the reflective emperor, lead the empire to such a man? Was it blind love, misjudgment? Or did Marcus, so bound to tradition and the Roman idea of dynastic continuity, feel he simply had no choice? In truth, Marcus had options. He could have chosen a capable general or senator as his successor. He could have broken with tradition, as Emperor Nerva once had, by adopting a worthy heir. But he didn't. He was named Commodus co-emperor in 177 CE, perhaps hoping his son would learn by example. Spoiler: he didn't. It's one of the great ironies of ancient history that the emperor who wrote Meditations, a work of enduring wisdom on human nature, couldn't or wouldn't prevent his own son from becoming the poster child for imperial failure. And Marcus wasn't blind to his son's flaws. There are hints, even in his writings, of disappointment and warning about flattery, pride, indulgence, all traits that Commodus embraced with enthusiasm. Still, Marcus never disowned him. Whether out of love, obligation, or exhaustion, he passed the torch and then watched the fire consume the house. Commodus's rule would end in assassination, and his death would plunge Rome into the year of the five emperors. It's a bleak postscript to a reign defined by stoic resilience. Marcus had kept the empire stitched together with wisdom and will. Commodus tore it open with ego and spectacle. And yet, perhaps the ultimate stoic lesson lies here too. Even emperors cannot control the future, only how they meet it. Marcus Aurelius died nearly 2,000 years ago, but his influence has never really left us. He was a rare kind of ruler, not just a man of power, but a man of principle. His meditations, scribbled during wars and sleepless nights, survived the fall of empires, the rise of religions, and the passage of time to become one of the most treasured philosophical texts in history. His legacy is paradoxical. As an emperor, he faced relentless war, plague, rebellion, and personal loss. Yet he remains admired not for victories or monuments, but for his mind, his restraint, his compassion, his refusal to be corrupted by absolute power. He didn't style himself as divine. He didn't demand worship. He wrote in plain Greek how to be a better human. Do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. Even modern thinkers, from statesmen to CEOs, athletes to psychologists, still quote Marcus Aurelius. His words appear on posters, in therapy sessions, in business guides, and in quiet moments of personal crisis. Why? Because he didn't speak like a king. He spoke like a flawed human, trying desperately to stay upright in a collapsing world. Yet Marcus's legacy is also bittersweet. Despite his wisdom, his reign marked the beginning of the end for Rome's golden age. His son, Commodus, accelerated the decline, and future emperors would rarely match his dignity or restraint. It's as if Marcus was the empire's last heartbeat of moral clarity before the fever set in. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of the story, that the man who understood impermanence better than anyone left behind something strangely permanent. His empire crumbled, his bloodline faltered, but his meditations were raw, intimate, unpolished. Survived. They survived because they were never meant to. They were never edited, never prepared for an audience. And that's what makes them immortal. They are the private whispers of a public man, the diary of an emperor who wanted nothing more than to live well, die justly, and leave the world no worse than he found it. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can hope to do. Marcus did it in sandals on horseback, with a stylus in hand, one stoic breath at a time. In ancient Babylon, justice wasn't just handed down by kings, it was etched in stone for all to see. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi commissioned a towering stele inscribed with what would become one of the earliest and most influential legal codes in human history, the Code of Hammurabi. Standing over 7 feet tall and written in cuneiform script, the black basalt monument was meant to project both order and authority. It didn't just govern, it warned. The Code of Hammurabi contained 282 laws covering everything from trade and family matters to theft and assault. But it wasn't democratic. These laws reflected a rigidly hierarchical society where penalties varied dramatically depending on your social status, for example. If a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, the punishment was to have his own bone broken, a clear case of the infamous eye for an eye approach. But if the same nobleman broke the bone of a commoner or a slave, the punishment was merely a fine. Justice in this system was proportional not only to the crime, but to the rank of the person involved. The laws emphasized personal responsibility and state authority. Builders whose poorly constructed homes collapsed and killed the inhabitants could be put to death. Merchants who cheated customers could face mutilation. Even family disputes were tightly regulated, with strict laws governing marriage, inheritance, and parental authority. Adultery, theft, and false accusation were especially harshly punished, often by execution or public shaming. What made the code revolutionary was not just its content, but its visibility. It stood in public spaces, carved with the image of Hammurabi receiving divine authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. This wasn't just a legal document, it was propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Hammurabi ruled by divine right and that his laws were sacred and immutable. However brutal it may seem by modern standards, the Code of Hammurabi established the concept that laws should be written, standardized, and accessible. It replaced arbitrary judgment with codified norms. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for later legal systems across the ancient world and continues to fascinate historians, lawyers, and ethicists alike. In Babylon, justice wasn't blind. It was watching, and it had a chisel. In ancient Egypt, justice wasn't just a legal concept, it was a cosmic force. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, a divine principle embodying truth, balance, and moral order. More than just a goddess, Ma'at represented the foundation of the universe itself. Pharaohs ruled not just with power, but with a responsibility to uphold Ma'at. In doing so, they maintained harmony between gods, nature, and society. Unlike the codified laws of Babylon, Egyptian justice was more flexible and case-specific. There was no singular legal code chiseled into stone. Instead, judges, often high officials or priests, interpreted Ma'at in their rulings. While this allowed for context-sensitive decisions, it also meant that justice could be highly subjective and dependent on the social standing of those involved. Court proceedings were both formal and performative. Cases could be tried before local officials or higher courts in the royal bureaucracy, depending on the severity. Plaintiffs and defendants presented their versions of events, and witnesses were essential. Written records, contracts, testimonies, and petitions were maintained on papyrus, a relatively advanced system of documentation for its time. For common offenses like theft or assault, punishments could include fines, beatings, or forced labor. More serious crimes such as tomb robbery or blasphemy were treated as offenses not only against the state, but against the gods. These could lead to execution, sometimes by fire, drowning, or impalement, or even posthumous punishment, like desecration of the corpse to prevent entry into the afterlife. Perhaps the most iconic image of Egyptian justice comes from the Book of the Dead, in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by Ammon, a crocodile lion hippopotamus monster, and the soul was condemned to oblivion. If it balanced with a feather, the soul was allowed to enter the eternal paradise of the field of reeds in Egypt. Justice was inseparable from spirituality. The courtroom was not just a venue for dispute, it was a sacred space where divine order was upheld. Unlike Babylon's rigid laws, Egyptian justice flowed with the moral tides of Ma'at, rewarding those who lived in harmony with truth and punishing those who disrupted the balance of the cosmos. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, justice took on a radically different form from the divine or king-centered systems of Babylon and Egypt. The Greeks began experimenting with something revolutionary, a justice system grounded in citizenship, debate, and public participation. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it laid the foundation for many modern legal concepts. Athenian democracy gave every male citizen the right to participate in the courts, both as a plaintiff or defendant. And as a juror, there were no professional judges or lawyers. Instead, massive juries, sometimes hundreds strong, were randomly selected from the population. These jurors were responsible not only for hearing cases, but for deciding verdicts and penalties, all without appeal. Trials were short, often completed in a single day, and each side was allowed a set amount of time to present their case, measured by a water clock called clepsydra. The types of cases range widely. Theft, slander, adultery, assault, property disputes, and even impiety, disrespecting the gods, could be brought to trial. While punishments for minor offenses were often fines or exile, more severe crimes could lead to death, particularly in cases involving treason or religious sacrilege. Socrates, for example, was famously sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Importantly, Greek justice systems did not rely on a written legal code accessible to all. While some laws were inscribed publicly, much of the legal knowledge was held by a small literate elite, meaning outcomes often depended more on rhetoric than on precedent. A clever speaker, or a rich citizen who could hire a skilled orator to speak for them, had a clear advantage. Justice was tied closely to persuasion and performance. Athenians also used a form of preemptive justice called ostracism, in which citizens could vote once a year to exile someone from the city for 10 years. No crime had to be proven, just a consensus that someone had become too dangerous or powerful for the health of the state. Though flawed, ancient Greece introduced the idea that justice could be a collective civic responsibility, not just the decree of a ruler or priest. It was an early and chaotic experiment in legal equality that still echoes in today's courtrooms. In ancient India, justice was rooted in a profound and layered concept called dharma, a term that defies easy translation but roughly means duty, righteousness, and cosmic law. Unlike the law codes of Babylon or the civic trials of Greece, Indian justice was not just about right and wrong. It was about maintaining harmony in the universe, society, and the self. Dharma varied depending on one's age, caste, gender, and stage of life, making justice a deeply contextual and moral affair. The legal framework in ancient India was first formalized in texts known as the Dharma Shastras, with the most well-known being the Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, compiled around the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. These texts weren't laws in the modern sense, but spiritual and social guidelines that shaped legal thinking for centuries. They defined everything from property rights and inheritance to marriage, contracts, and punishments. The caste system was central to this legal vision. Brahmins, priests, kshatriyas, warriors, vaishyas, merchants, and shudras. Laborers were each subject to different rules and penalties. For instance, a Brahmin committing a certain offense might face a fine or temporary exclusion from rituals, while a shudra committing the same act could be sentenced to corporal punishment or worse. Justice in this system was not blind. It was hierarchical, deeply tied to one's birth. Despite this, Indian justice was not entirely unforgiving. The concept of intent mattered, as did repentance. A wrongdoer could lessen punishment through penance or charity, and judges were encouraged to consider the moral and spiritual state of the accused. Kings often served as the highest judicial authority, advised by Brahmin scholars and ministers, blending divine law with royal decree. Trials could involve ordeals, especially when evidence was inconclusive. These included holding red-hot iron, walking through fire, or retrieving objects from boiling oil, believed to reveal guilt or innocence based on divine will. Such methods were seen as a last resort, not standard practice. Above all, justice in ancient India aimed to restore cosmic balance. It wasn't just about punishing crime. It was about righting spiritual wrongs, correcting social disorder, and guiding souls back toward Dharma. It was a justice system where morality, religion, and law were inseparable. Across the ancient world, when legal systems hit a wall, when evidence was lacking, witnesses were unreliable, or accusations unprovable, societies often turned to the gods to decide. One of the most dramatic and terrifying ways this happened was through trial by ordeal, a practice used in multiple cultures, including Babylon, India, and later medieval Europe. The idea was simple, but brutal. If human justice couldn't determine guilt, divine justice would intervene through pain in Babylon. One common ordeal involved throwing the accused into a river. If they floated or survived, the gods had spared them, and they were declared innocent. If they drowned, guilt was confirmed, though inconveniently, the dead could no longer be punished. This method reflected a deep belief in divine oversight, as water was seen as a sacred and impartial force in ancient India, as outlined in the Dharma Shastras. Multiple forms of ordeal existed. These included walking across hot iron plowshares, retrieving coins from boiling oil, or surviving exposure to venom. The logic wasn't cruelty, it was divine arbitration. Surviving unharmed or with minimal injury was interpreted as proof of innocence. The gods, it was believed, would not allow the innocent to suffer without cause, though horrific by modern standards. Trial by ordeal wasn't always purely physical. In some cases, it involved oaths taken in sacred spaces. Swearing on a holy object, or invoking a deity's wrath was thought to bind a speaker to truth. Lying under such conditions was believed to invite divine punishment, either immediately or in the afterlife. The psychological power of the ordeal was immense. It could terrify the guilty into confession and bolster the faithful's belief in cosmic justice. But it also revealed how fragile human legal systems were, how deeply ancient peoples felt the need for something beyond human judgment. Ordeals were usually a last resort, a way to settle cases no one could otherwise resolve. Despite their reliance on supernatural outcomes, ordeals reflected a desire for fairness. They were brutal, yes, but they were also democratic in a strange way. Kings and peasants alike could be subjected to them. In the absence of forensics or due process, suffering became a courtroom, and the gods were expected to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. In ancient Egypt, justice was not administered by impartial courts or elected juries. It flowed directly from the divine authority of the pharaoh. As both king and living god, the pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. This meant that maintaining justice wasn't just a political duty, it was a sacred obligation. The pharaoh had ultimate legal authority. His word could overrule any judgment, command the execution of criminals, pardon the guilty, or rewrite laws at will. This concentration of power was justified not through human logic, but through divine sanction. To disobey the pharaoh was to disrupt the harmony of the universe. But the pharaoh didn't govern alone. A vast bureaucratic system extended across Egypt, from royal officials in the capital to local magistrates in provincial towns. These officials acted as judges, scribes, and investigators. Their decisions were guided by royal edicts and the principles of Ma'at rather than a formal legal code. Written laws were rare and largely case-based, passed down through precedent and scribal training. Courtrooms varied in size and importance. In local villages, disputes might be handled by a council of elders or temple priests. In major cities, formal judgment halls heard complex cases involving property, theft, assault, and inheritance. Proceedings were recorded in meticulous detail on papyrus scrolls, many of which survive today, giving us a rare window into how ancient Egyptians argued and judged. Trials included elements of both testimony and written evidence. Plaintiffs and defendants gave their accounts, often under oath. Witnesses were called and physical evidence, when available, was considered. False accusations were taken seriously and, if proven, could result in the accuser receiving the punishment intended for the defendant. Punishments varied widely, from restitution and fines to flogging, forced labor, or execution. Crimes against temples, tombs, or royal property were treated with special severity. Yet the system also emphasized rehabilitation and compensation. In many cases, wrongdoers were given opportunities to make amends, particularly if they confessed voluntarily. What made Egyptian justice unique was its fusion of absolute monarchy and moral expectation. The pharaoh may have ruled with unchecked power, but he was expected to wield it with fairness. In the eyes of his people and his gods, a just ruler wasn't merely feared. He was revered as the guardian of cosmic balance, while divine kings and priestly classes dominated justice in many ancient civilizations. Ancient Greece, particularly democratic Athens, took a dramatically different approach. Justice was no longer the exclusive domain of gods and monarchs. It became a public duty, shared and enacted by citizens through councils and popular assemblies. In Athens, the administration of justice rested primarily with two major institutions, the ecclesia, the citizen assembly, and Heliaea, a massive popular court composed of citizen jurors. Rather than being handed down from rulers, law and justice were shaped by everyday male citizens who took turns participating in governance. Laws were proposed and voted on by the assembly, while trials were conducted by large juries, sometimes numbering 500 or more to prevent bribery or manipulation. There were no judges in the modern sense. Instead, magistrates are selected by lottery or popular vote. Organized trials and ensured procedures were followed. However, it was the jurors, drawn randomly from citizens over the age of 30, who decided the verdict. With no appeal process and no deliberation room, verdicts were final and penalties were voted on directly after guilt was determined. This system favored persuasive speech over evidence. Defendants and plaintiffs had to represent themselves or hire skilled orators to write speeches on their behalf. Rhetoric was everything, and clever manipulation of public emotions could sway the outcome. While this system promoted civic participation, it also meant that justice could be uneven, less about law and more about persuasion. For certain political matters or threats to the state, special assemblies or councils were convened. One famous mechanism was ostracism, where citizens voted once a year to exile anyone deemed dangerous to democracy. No crime had to be committed, just a public consensus that someone's influence was unhealthy. 10 years in exile, no trial, no defense. Despite its imperfections, the Greek council-based system introduced powerful new ideas: the importance of peer judgment, open debate, and the notion that law belongs to the people. It was messy, emotional, and sometimes unjust, but it was also revolutionary. In Greek justice, the courtroom was a stage, the citizen was the judge, and justice was a public performance, one in which every man had a part to play, and where power was held briefly in the hands of the people themselves. In ancient India, justice extended far beyond courtrooms and punishments. It was interwoven with the concept of karma, the belief that every action carries moral weight and spiritual consequence, both in this life and in the next. Unlike the civic trials of Greece or the royal decrees of Egypt, Indian justice emphasized a cosmic ledger where no wrongdoing escaped ultimate accountability. Karma wasn't a legal mechanism, it was a moral law embedded in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions. Good actions led to positive outcomes, while bad actions brought suffering, even if not immediately. A thief might evade human justice, but the universe itself would balance the scales. This belief reinforced ethical behavior, even in the absence of enforcement. Still, ancient India did have structured legal systems. The Manusmriti and other Dharma Shastras offered guidance not just for courts, but for individual conduct. They outlined specific duties for each caste and role in society, reinforcing that justice was not a one-size-fits-all model. Kings were expected to rule according to Dharma, and failing to do so could bring spiritual as well as political consequences. Buddhism, which emerged in the 5th century BCE, further deepened the karmic view of justice. It rejected caste-based legal inequality and promoted universal moral principles, nonviolence, truthfulness, and compassion. While not a legal code, Buddhist ethics influenced rulers like Emperor Ashoka, who in the 3rd century BCE renounced conquest and reformed his empire around Buddhist values. His famous rock edicts speak of mercy, tolerance, and the moral responsibility of governance. Justice, then, was about much more than trial and punishment. It was about inner purity, intention, and spiritual accountability. A person might escape a king's penalty, but not the consequences of their own deeds. Likewise, a king who ruled unjustly was believed to be storing up suffering for himself in future lives. This karmic understanding of justice created a powerful internalized system of order. It was deeply personal, and for many far more intimidating than any earthly authority. Whether enforced by law or left to the cosmos, Indian civilization viewed justice not merely as retribution, but as a force for restoring harmony between self, society, and the universe itself. Though thousands of years have passed since the rise of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India, their justice systems continue to shape how we think about crime, punishment, and fairness today. These ancient civilizations laid the intellectual, moral, and procedural foundations of legal systems that still guide societies across the globe. Babylon gave us the earliest known codified law. The idea that justice should be publicly visible, consistent, and enforced by the state. The principle of an eye for an eye still appears in legal and ethical debates, symbolizing both the call for proportionate punishment and the dangers of retributive excess. Egypt introduced the concept of divine kingship and moral law, where justice was not just social but cosmic, the emphasis on balance, truth, and harmony. Echoes in modern ideas of restorative justice, where the goal isn't just to punish but to restore community equilibrium. Greece revolutionized justice by tying it to citizenship and participation. Trial by jury, public debate, and the notion of peer judgment began in Athens and remains central to many legal systems today. Though imperfect and exclusionary, Greek democracy planted the seeds for legal systems that value public involvement and accountability. India contributed deeply spiritual and ethical dimensions to justice. The concepts of dharma and karma added a moral backbone to legal systems, encouraging personal responsibility and self-regulation. Even today, Indian law reflects a hybrid system where British legal structures coexist with religious and customary laws, demonstrating the enduring power of ancient traditions. These systems weren't flawless. They were often unjust, classist, patriarchal, and brutal. They privileged the elite, punished the vulnerable, and enforced hierarchies. But they also posed essential questions still relevant today. Who gets to define justice? Is it grounded in divine authority, civic consensus, or moral truth? Should law be equal for all or adjusted for social roles? How do we balance punishment with mercy? Modern law may be more humane and structured, but it carries the DNA of these early systems. We still carve laws into stone, figuratively, expecting them to uphold order. We still debate justice in courts, assemblies, and temples of thought, and we still wrestle with the same eternal tension between power and fairness, law and morality, crime and consequence. In many ways, our pursuit of justice is ancient and ongoing. Let's start with your first and probably most important life choice. Where are you living? If you said a bustling 14th century city full of opportunity and culture, congratulations. You're already 85% dead. Cities during the Black Plague were not charming medieval postcards. They were overpopulated, unwashed, and alarmingly enthusiastic about throwing waste into the streets. Imagine thousands of people crammed together in wooden buildings with no plumbing, no sanitation, and rats so comfortable they probably paid rent. Urban centers like London, Paris, and Florence were the plague's all-you-can-eat buffet. Closed quarters? Check. Open gutters? Check. Livestock living indoors? You bet. The cities were a hotbed of human contact, pest activity, and very bad smells. If airborne pathogens didn't get you, the psychological trauma of daily smells probably would. You didn't even need to be sick, just near someone who was. Markets, churches, bathhouses. On the rare occasion they were open, and inns packed people into tight spaces. Fleas loved it. Rats thrived. And you, the innocent city dweller just trying to buy onions, were one bite away from a full body breakdown. Now contrast this with the countryside. Yes, it had its downsides, like isolation, weather, and the occasional angry goose. But crucially, it had space. You had fewer neighbors, fewer crowds, and significantly fewer rats per square foot if you lived on a farm. Or in a sleepy village up a hill where the nearest human lived 2 goat lengths away, your chances of survival were dramatically better. Even better, remote monasteries. Some religious orders, like the Carthusians, practiced near total silence and isolation. Their lifestyle wasn't designed for plague survival, but it just happened to be the medieval equivalent of an elite quarantine bubble. In short, if you value your lungs, your blood, and your continued existence, the best move in 1348 was to get as far away from people as legally or illegally possible. Cancel your trips, leave the market early, and if anyone says it's probably not that bad, that's your cue to grab your cloak and leave the city immediately. Imagine this. It's 1349. Someone sneezes in your general direction. Do you politely ask if they're okay? B. Offer them a clove of garlic, or C. Run like your life depends on it, because it does. Correct answer C. Always C back then. No one knew what a virus was, but they did understand one thing. If someone near you started sweating, coughing, or bleeding from strange places, it was time to become a recluse. Social distancing didn't have a catchy name yet, but the survivors practiced it religiously. Plague was thought to be spread by bad air, also known as miasma. This wasn't completely accurate. It was the fleas, not the fog, but avoiding other humans who reeked of decay. Accidentally excellent advice. People who withdrew early to the countryside, to a family cottage, to anywhere that wasn't full of suspicious coughing, had much better odds of making it out alive. Entire families survived by simply closing the door and not opening it until the next year. Did it strain relationships? Absolutely. Was it awkward when your cousin came knocking, begging for soup and sneezing through the keyhole? Extremely. But letting them in could mean you'd all be dead by Sunday. So no soup for Cousin Gregory. Some nobles and wealthy families even fled their cities at the first sign of plague. The wealthy Boccaccio family, for example, packed up and left Florence, social distancing with wine, poetry, and zero peasant contact. Smart. Meanwhile, the less fortunate learned to self-isolate through trial and error. Mostly errors. Markets, festivals, weddings. Any large gathering was a game of microbiological roulette. If you had the willpower to skip them, stay home, and talk to your cat instead of your neighbor, you had a real shot at outliving the pandemic. It's simple. Every interaction was a potential death sentence. And while medieval people didn't have Twitter threads about flattening the curve, they did figure out very quickly that fewer handshakes meant more birthdays. If you were lucky enough to survive the Black Plague, chances are you weren't doing it in velvet. But let's talk fashion, specifically how your wardrobe could get you killed in 1348. The medieval upper class loved long, flowing robes for trimmed sleeves and thick, ornate fabrics that said, "I have money, and I definitely don't plan on fleeing quickly." But to fleas, that wasn't style. That was prime real estate. The plague wasn't picky. Rich or poor, if you had fabric and skin, you were fair game. But the richer you were, the more layers you wore. And the more space you have fleas to move in, settle down, and start a small family. In this way, your fashion sense could function like a hotel chain for parasites. What had worked? Simplicity. Survivors tended to wear shorter tunics, less fabric, tighter sleeves, and linen. The one fabric that fleas weren't writing love letters about. Bonus points if you washed your clothes more than once a season, which, yes, was considered excessive by medieval standards. Some communities went as far as burning entire wardrobes, thinking the disease clung to cloth. This wasn't entirely wrong. Fleas can survive for days without hosts and happily hitch a ride on your favorite overcoat. That velvet cloak with the squirrel fur trim. It's not a flex if it's also carrying microscopic death. People also wore accessories, lots of them. But the beaded necklaces, perfumes, and rosemary bundles weren't doing much to stop the plague. Unless you countered offending everyone's noses into keeping their distance, in which case bravo. And if you're wondering about armor, no, it didn't help either. You couldn't sword fight the plague, though dying in full plate because you refused to remove your gauntlets long enough to wash your hands would be very on brand for certain nights. If you were hoping to outlive the Black Plague, geography was more than just scenic. It could literally save your skin, especially if that skin was far, far uphill. Medieval science had gaps. They didn't know what bacteria were, but they did notice patterns, like how people living on hills didn't drop dead quite as fast as those in swampy lowlands. Coincidence? Maybe. But if your neighbor's corpse just fell over the fence, you probably weren't sticking around to demand peer-reviewed studies. Elevation had a few sneaky advantages. First, rats, the little death chariots of the plague, hated climbing. Or rather, they hated staying at elevation, especially where food was scarce and temperatures dropped. The colder the hill, the less likely you were to host a flea festival. Second wind. Higher ground meant better air circulation. And while bad air or miasma wasn't the direct cause of the plague, fleeing stagnant, putrid-smelling alleys for crisp hilltop breezes, that was a good call anyway. At the very least, it spared you the aroma of medieval city life, a blend of human waste, goat hair, and desperation. Hills also came with the luxury of fewer people. That's right, elevation plus isolation, a winning combo in any century. The plague couldn't spread if there was no one to catch it and no one to breathe on you in line at the communal water barrel. Some monasteries and manors were already built on high ground, not for plague reasons, but because they liked the view and hated being invaded. But when the Black Death rolled through, those foundations suddenly felt visionary. You didn't need to be rich to head uphill. Even shepherds, goat herds, and that one guy who talked to birds had the right idea. Fresh air, no neighbors, and a steep walk deterring both the plague and surprise visits. And if someone from the valley came trudging up with a cough and a story about how they think it's just a cold, you had a valid excuse to roll a barrel downhill at them in self-defense. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval people were not famous for their love of soap or water or personal boundaries. By the 14th century, the Great Bathing Renaissance had hit a rough patch. Earlier medieval periods had public bathhouses, some quite elaborate, but by the time the Black Death arrived, bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. Medical experts, and I use that term generously, believe that hot water opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to disease. In other words, washing makes you more likely to die. This, of course, was the opposite of true. Plague-carrying fleas love dirty, unwashed skin, especially the kind of skin buried under 3 layers of wool and last month's stew. People who bathed, even infrequently, were less attractive to parasites. They didn't know this, of course. They just thought they were unlucky enough to smell like sin. Turns out sin smelled like survival. Soap existed, but it was either homemade from ashes and animal fat or absurdly expensive. Still, some survivors washed their hands and faces regularly, even if it was more superstition than science. Others bathed with herbs, vinegar, or wine, which was less effective but did make you smell like a salad someone prayed over. Clothes were another problem. Laundry was done maybe once a month if you were rich. It typically involved beating your garments against a rock and hoping the lice took the hint. Those who took the time to boil their linens would change outfits weekly. Not exactly clean by today's standards, but positively sterile by plague-era benchmarks. And let's not forget dental hygiene. Toothpaste didn't exist, but chewing mint leaves or rubbing salt on your teeth was a thing. Again, it didn't cure the plague, but it did make your deathbed conversation slightly more tolerable. So, could a bath save your life? Not directly, but it drastically reduced your chances of turning into a mobile fleet banquet. Plus, it separated you from the crowd. Literally. People avoided you because you smelled weirdly clean. Medieval doctors, men of great confidence, questionable hygiene, and even worse theories. If you found yourself getting a bit plaguey in 1349 and decided I'd better call a doctor, congratulations, you've just made your final mistake. To be fair, they were doing their best with what little they understood, which was nothing. The leading theory of the time was the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humors were out of balance. The solution? Drain something. Usually blood, occasionally dignity. So you'd show up coughing blood, and they'd respond by sticking leeches on you until you looked like a deflated wineskin. Or worse, they'd slice open a vein to let the bad out, which had the side effect of also letting you out. Then there were the plague doctors dressed in their iconic bird beak masks stuffed with flowers, herbs, and spices. The beak wasn't a fashion statement. It was their primitive version of PPE. They thought good smells warded off bad air, which wasn't totally wrong. If you define working as keeping you too dizzy to notice the smell of rotting bodies, or tools. Wooden sticks for poking at a safe distance, a cane for nudging you into a mass grave if things didn't go well, and a whole lot of sage burning. Treatment options were equally grim. Rubbing onions on your armpits, drinking crushed emeralds, carrying a dead toad in a bag around your neck, sitting in smoke-filled rooms. In other words, if it sounded stupid, painful, or highly flammable, it was probably prescribed. Ironically, the people who fared best were often the ones who avoided medical attention altogether, like nuns, midwives, and herbalists who stuck to basic hygiene, clean bandages, and staying calm. In the midst of the Black Plague, when cities turned into open-air morgues and doctors prescribed onions for everything short of decapitation, one group quietly outperformed everyone in the survival game: monks. But not just any monks. We're talking about the stay-at-home, vow of silence type. Think Carthusians, not traveling friars with pockets full of fleas. Why did monastic life offer such plague-proof potential? For starters, monasteries were often isolated, perched on hillsides or nestled in rural nowhere. They were designed for prayer and reflection, not traffic, festivals, or overcrowded inns with that one guy coughing into his soup. Then there were the rules. Monastic life wasn't free for all. It came with structure, scheduled meals, strict sanitation by medieval standards, and a suspicious lack of hand-holding. Shared utensils? Not likely. Hugging? Spiritually discouraged. Group bathhouse orgies? Absolutely not. They also had access to food and clean water, a huge bonus when much of the population was too sick to farm or boil a pot. Monasteries stored grain, grew their own herbs, and most importantly, didn't rely on urban markets swarming with rats and regret. Oh, and did we mention they were celibate? Which meant no late night visits to plaguey tavern wenches, just you, your thoughts, and the occasional Latin chant to keep you company. Now, not all monks made it out alive. Some, bless them, chose to act as caregivers. They ventured into cities to help the sick. Noble, yes, but statistically inadvisable. Traveling clergy had the worst of both worlds: exposure to dying strangers and the inability to run away, because it would have looked bad in the Bible. So if you were going the monk route, the best bet was to join early, stay put, and say no to missions. Of course, you didn't have to be a monk to benefit from the monk lifestyle. You just needed to copy their habits, live in the middle of nowhere, grow your own food. Limit contact within the Black Death economy. Certain jobs came with a special bonus: immediate exposure to everyone's germs. Let's start with messengers. Their job was to ride between towns, carrying letters, proclamations, or ominous royal decrees no one wanted to hear. Great cardio, terrible survival odds. Every time a messenger dismounted and handed over a scroll, they were essentially swapping paper and plague with whoever had just sneezed on the last delivery. Then there were merchants, the Uber Eats of the 14th century, minus hygiene and customer satisfaction. Merchants traveled between cities, markets, and ports, bringing spices, cloth, and fleas from one contaminated location to the next. They were plague super spreaders before super spreading had a name. If you worked these gigs, you were the human equivalent of a courier pigeon with a death wish. So what jobs did you give you a better shot? Blacksmiths, bakers, shepherds, and millers. People who worked with fire, grain, or animals and mostly kept to themselves. These folks didn't need to travel far. They didn't have to shake hands with strangers or enter plague-saturated cities for meetings that could have been parchment scrolls. Then there were grave diggers. Morbid, yes, but oddly secure. The job wasn't plague-proof, but they had better tools like gloves, shovels, and the highly underrated strategy of not touching things with your face. Some even learned to recognize early plague signs and took great pride in not dying like everyone else around them. If you were really lucky, you could be a recluse, hermit, or mildly disliked goat herder. Solitary work was suddenly in vogue. Your antisocial behavior, rebranded as wise pandemic planning. Even artisans like cobblers and weavers fared decently. They worked from home, took limited clients, and could pretend they were just booked when someone sketchy knocked on the door, coughing and asking for shoes. In 1349, the fewer errands you ran, the longer you lived. Let's get one thing straight. In Plague-era Europe, rats weren't just background noise. They were the main characters. Hairy, twitchy, plague chariot-riding villains in your everyday life. And they had one mission: get into your food and leave you with a parting gift called Yersinia pestis. If you wanted to survive the Black Death, one of the smartest things you could do, besides running uphill and avoiding humans, was to elevate your pantry. Literally, grain bins on the floor. That's a rat rave waiting to happen. Open baskets of bread under your bed. Congratulations, you've opened a plague-themed buffet. Rats weren't picky eaters, and neither were their fleas. The moment rodents set up shop in your pantry, your odds of living past Lent dropped faster than your grain reserves. Now, some medieval households wised up. They stored food on high wooden shelves, in ceramic jars, or inside suspended boxes hanging from the ceiling like weird piñatas that no one was allowed to hit. These weren't fancy design choices. They were desperate attempts to keep the plague at tail's length. And then there were cats, the underappreciated MVPs of rodent control. The more felines you had prowling your kitchen, the better. Unfortunately, some places accused cats of being witches, familiars, and killed them, which, spoiler alert, made the rat problem much worse. It's hard to survive when you've just executed your only line of defense. Also, let's talk about your trash. Throwing scraps out the window wasn't just rude, it was rat bait. The same went for leaving compost heaps next to your house like some kind of rodent Airbnb. Smart survivors moved their waste far from their living quarters, preferably into someone else's yard. It's worth noting that rats didn't technically cause the plague, the fleas did. But fleas don't travel long distances on their own. When disaster strikes, People tend to respond in one of two ways: calmly seeking rational solutions or joining a screaming, torch-wielding mob convinced it's all the neighbors' fault. Guess which one was more popular in 1348? The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it shattered brains, and with no germ theory, microscopes, or decent leadership, folks were left to invent explanations. Many of them sounded like it must be them, followed by pitchforks, torches, and wildly misdirected violence. In some towns, mobs accused outsiders, Jews, foreigners, and basically anyone who looked like they hadn't sneezed recently. People believed wells were being poisoned, that the plague was punishment from God, that a local widow with too many cats had caused all this with her suspicious herbal teas. Spoiler: none of it helped. In fact, mob behavior usually made things worse. You gather a large group of already paranoid people, shout over each other about how he coughed near my cow, and then storm the victim's home to what? Solve the plague by burning it down. Smart. Real smart. Worse still, mobs brought people together physically, huddled in sweaty crowds, yelling and swapping bacteria like they were trading Pokemon cards. You didn't just risk making a moral mistake. You also risked contracting the very disease you were trying to blame on someone else. The people who actually survived the Black Death were often the ones who kept a low profile. Not because they were cowards, but because they weren't interested in collective panic rituals. While the mob was busy dragging an astrologer out of town for reading stars, too confidently, survivors were boarding up their windows, boiling water, and quietly not dying. There's a lesson here. Panic spreads faster than plague, and angry crowds are rarely wise problem solvers. Unless you enjoy the smell of smoke, moral failure, and a guaranteed exposure to cough droplets, maybe don't grab the torch. Because in a pandemic, the only thing more contagious than disease is ignorance at scale. Garlic, nature's breath mint, seasoning staple, and medieval body spray of choice when the plague arrived. People didn't have vaccines, antibiotics, or even a firm grasp on what a germ was. What they did have was garlic, and they used it for everything. Ate it raw, hung it over their doors, wore it around their necks like cloves of aromatic defiance. Was it scientifically effective? Let's be honest, not really. But in a world where your other options included bathing in vinegar, drinking molten gold, or letting someone drill a hole in your skull to release the bad air, garlic was relatively reasonable. Why garlic? For one, it smelled strong, and that was a big deal. The leading theory of disease at the time was miasma, or bad air. So if you could overpower the smell of rotting corpses and human waste with something aggressively herbal, people figured you were on the path to health. Garlic was the Axe body spray of 1348, but there's a twist. Garlic is a mild antibacterial and insect repellent. Modern science confirms that it does, in fact, have some antimicrobial properties. So while medieval folks didn't know what they were doing, they may have accidentally made themselves less appealing to fleas, the actual plague carriers. That said, don't give garlic too much credit. It wasn't a magical shield. You couldn't rub a clove on your forehead and walk through a corpse pile unscathed. Some people ate so much garlic they became socially unapproachable, which, ironically, did help with social distancing. Also, garlic didn't work if you were still doing everything else wrong. Wearing flea-riddled robes, visiting sick neighbors, drinking from shared cups at a crowded funeral feast. All the garlic in the world wouldn't save you. You just die extra seasoned. In the 14th century, the ability to smell something pleasant, like roses, wasn't just a charming sensory experience. It was basically a diagnostic tool. If your nose still worked, congratulations, you probably weren't dead yet. The logic was simple. The plague often hits hard and fast, bringing along symptoms like fever, vomiting, swelling, and crucially, a sudden loss of the will to stand. One particularly disturbing sign was the onset of overwhelming stench, both from the sick person and the surrounding city. If you could smell flowers instead of rotting flesh, you were already ahead of the game. This is where the posy came in. People of means, or even just good instincts, carried little bouquets of herbs and flowers called pomanders or nosegays. These weren't romantic gestures. They were DIY gas masks made of lavender, mint, sage, and rose petals. You'd carry one in hand. Stuff it in your sleeve, or just glue it to your face like a desperate Renaissance party favor. Was this effective? Technically, no, but symbolically, it worked wonders. Walking around with a floral sachet made you look like you were trying, which during the plague put you ahead of roughly half the population. The reasoning was again tied to miasma theory, the idea that foul smells carry disease so naturally. If you could overpower the stench with roses, you were cleansing the air. In practice, you were just giving yourself something to focus on that wasn't death. Plus, the people who used flowers and herbs often had the means to isolate, wash occasionally, and avoid the worst hit areas. So it wasn't the roses themselves, it was the lifestyle that came with them. Rose sniffers tended to avoid cesspits and STIs. Also, people kept flowers in the home, burned incense, and simmered herbs on coals. Not because they were aromatherapists, but because living with 10 people in a one-room hut needed some kind of vibe adjustment, which, frankly, may have saved your life. Let's face it, the plague wasn't just a test of immunity. It was a test of your social calendar. In a time when human contact was roughly as safe as licking a dagger, friendship became inconvenient. Every hug, handshake, or shared mug was a game of bacterial roulette. And the people with the best odds? The ones who politely declined all invitations forever. Medieval survivors were often those who lived quiet, uneventful lives. Not because they were insightful virologists, but because they just didn't like people that much to begin with. In short, introverts thrived. That one neighbor who always said, "I'll come by later," and never did. Alive? The couple who skipped every market fair, wedding feast, and Saints' Day party. Also alive. The guy who muttered to his chickens and lived in a shed. Weird, but alive. The more friends you had, the more chances the plague had to hitch a ride into your home. Even kind gestures were dangerous. Offering bread to a sick neighbor. Risky. Visiting your aunt to check in. Deadly group prayer circles. Holy, but highly contagious. Many survivors limited their contact to just a few close family members. Even that came with rules. Eat separately, avoid suspicious coughing, and if necessary, build two houses and shout between windows if someone sneezes. That was the medieval equivalent of being unfriended for life. It wasn't personal. It was survival math. Even monasteries and noble households practiced early forms of quarantine. If one person showed symptoms, they were sent to a different wing. Or if you were poor, just told to go lie in the barn and we'll see. Here's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes surviving the Black Death came down to dumb luck. Good choices help, sure. Washing occasionally, avoiding festivals, not licking strangers. But even if you did everything right, a single flea with an attitude could ruin your whole life. That said, the odds really improved if you also happened to be extremely bored, because excitement in the 14th century often involved people, movement, noise, and very bad decisions. It was the extroverts, the wanderers, the just popping into town crowd who tended to get invited to funerals they didn't realize were their own survivors. They leaned into monotony. The plague didn't care how charismatic you were. It didn't care about your ambitions, your side hustle, or your dream to open a tavern in Bruges. It cared if you were within biting range. So the guy who spent his days tending beets and muttering about the weather immune. No, but invisible to danger. Almost. There were also genetic flukes. Modern scientists believe some people carried mutations, like the CCR5D32 gene, that made them more resistant to the plague's effects. They didn't know that at the time, of course. They just thought, weird that I'm not bleeding from my armpits like everyone else. So yes, if you were genetically fortunate, living alone, mildly antisocial, fond of boiled water, and unreasonably attached to your cat, congratulations, you were a medieval elite. But the moment you got creative, tried a new city, invited friends over, joined a flagellant parade, or drank from that mysterious shared chalice at the market, the odds turned. Boring meant routine. Routine meant fewer surprises, and fewer surprises meant fewer unexplained rashes and less spontaneous organ failure. If you made it through the coughing, the bleeding, the rotting streets, and the awkwardly aggressive garlic breath, congratulations. You've officially entered plague survivor territory. And now you face your final task. Make sure someone knows you were here, Because surviving the Black Death wasn't just about avoiding death, it was about being remembered for it. Enter the scribes, the monks, the diary keepers, and the slightly traumatized villagers with a good memory and access to parchment. These were the real MVPs. Not only did they outlive everyone, they also had the energy to write about it. People like Giovanni Boccaccio, who gave us the Decameron, a book about wealthy Florentines hiding from the plague by telling stories in the countryside. Or that one monk in Yorkshire who scribbled in the margins. A great pestilence came and many died. Minimalist but effective. Writing things down was more than just catharsis. It was a way to process what had happened, to pass on warnings, and to gently humble brag about your immune system. Survivors who recorded their stories shaped how future generations understood the plague, and in doing so, they turned not dying into a sort of legacy project. But here's the catch. You had to outlive the printing deadline. That meant staying cautious even after the worst had passed. Many let their guard down too soon. They celebrated, reunited, hosted extremely premature feasts, and then died in the second wave. So if you truly wanted to make it to the end and write your story, don't rush back to town. Don't hug anyone just because the bishop said the plague is probably over. Don't accept free ale from a man with visible boils. Instead, wait, staying bored. Keep your diary nearby. Observe. And when it was safe, really safe, pick up a quill and record your tale. Maybe no one would read it. Maybe it would molder in a dusty chest. But maybe, just maybe, some future historian would stumble across it and say this one knew what they were doing. Because surviving a pandemic is impressive, but surviving it with receipts, that's eternal. Long before psychiatry had a name, mental illness was seen not as a medical condition, but a divine message or a curse. In ancient Mesopotamia, if someone experienced hallucinations, spoke incoherently, or acted erratically, the first assumption was a madness. It was possession. The Sumerians believed that evil spirits could enter the human body and take control. A disturbed mind meant that a demon had claimed the soul. The earliest recorded treatments were not based on logic or science. Instead, they combined ritual, prayer, and magic. Clay tablets from Assyria describe detailed incantations designed to drive out the spiritual invader. Exorcists were more trusted than doctors. These weren't obscure fringe beliefs. They were mainstream diagnostics. In ancient Egypt, things weren't much different. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, records both physiological and spiritual explanations for strange behaviors. If you wept without cause, forgot your own name, or withdrew from others, you might have a wandering womb or be cursed by God. Treatment, aromatherapy, ritual purification, and appeals to divine intervention. They believed that the heart was the seat of thought, not the brain, but the Greeks took things to another level. In Homeric epics, madness is often the work of gods. Ajax slaughtering sheep, thinking they were his enemies, a direct result of divine interference. The concept of divine madness became so embedded in Greek culture that it was sometimes seen as a form of inspiration. Plato even argued that some forms of madness were gifts from the gods, leading to prophecy, artistic genius, or poetic insight. Poets weren't mad. They were chosen. Yet it wasn't all spiritual. Hippocrates, often considered the father of modern medicine, offered a more physical explanation. He blamed imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Melancholia, what we might now call depression, was an excess of black bile. His solutions? Diet, rest, and lifestyle changes. Not bad for a man born in 460 BC. This duality, spiritual versus physical, would define how societies viewed mental illness for centuries. A person could be cursed or chemically imbalanced, a prophet or a lunatic. The line between healer and priest was razor thin, and depending on where you lived, the voices in your head could either earn you a temple or a burial in medieval Europe. Mental illness lost whatever grace it had under the Greeks. Gone were the philosophical debates about divine inspiration or humoral imbalance. Instead, the church stepped in, and with it came fire, brimstone, and fear. If you were hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there, the likely conclusion wasn't a humoral imbalance. It was sin, or worse, Satan himself. Madness was now framed through a religious lens. The mentally ill were often viewed as morally corrupt, spiritually weak, or possessed by demons. The devil was the prime suspect. A peasant woman wandering the streets in rags, muttering to herself, might be seen as a witch. A nobleman weeping for days without cause could be accused of harboring unconfessed sin. Confession, flagellation, and prayer were considered viable treatments. Physicians deferred to priests. The institutions of the time didn't fare any better. There were few dedicated places for the mentally ill. Most were left to wander the countryside, survive in dungeons, or rot in overcrowded monasteries. In some towns they were chained in public squares for their own safety, where locals could poke them with sticks or throw coins at them for amusement. Madness became entertainment. Then came Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam. Founded in the 13th century, it was one of the first institutions to house the mentally disturbed. But the house is putting it politely. Bedlam quickly devolved into a human zoo. Visitors would pay admission to gape at the lunatics, chained to walls or howling behind barred windows. Treatments included cold water dunkings, bleeding, purging, and whipping. The theory was simple: drive the devil out by force. And yet, amidst the horror, some faint sparks of humanity appeared. Some monks offered kindness and shelter. Islamic physicians like Avicenna, operating far from the Inquisition's grip, still promoted humoral theory and gentle care. In Moorish Spain, hospitals treated the mentally ill with music therapy and fresh air, but in Christendom, mercy was rare and ignorance ruled. Madness was a word soaked in dread. You didn't get help. You got chained. You didn't find healing. You found exile. For most medieval sufferers, the world offered little more than a dungeon, a priest, and prayers that no one was listening to. The age of madness had begun, and it would take centuries before compassion caught up. The Renaissance is often romanticized as a period of rediscovery, of beauty, science, and human potential. But for those suffering from mental illness, the shift was more complicated than hopeful. As classical knowledge resurfaced, so too did older medical ideas, especially from Hippocrates and Galen. The church's grip loosened slightly, and for a moment madness was allowed to have a body again, not just a soul. Physicians began to reframe mental illness through anatomy and imbalance rather than sin and demons. Melancholia, hysteria, mania. These became recognizable terms again, treated, at least in theory, with diet, exercise, and calm surroundings. There was even a renewed interest in astrology, with the stars sometimes blamed for emotional instability, a moody temperament. Maybe Saturn was in the wrong house. But don't mistake this for kindness. The Renaissance mind was still deeply suspicious of what it couldn't quantify, and the body was still subject to cleansing. Bloodletting remained popular. So did induced vomiting. If someone was too agitated, they might be restrained for days or subjected to spinning chairs designed to reset the brain. In Italy and France, asylums grew more common, not out of compassion, but to protect society from the unpredictables. One notable voice stood out: Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician. In the mid-1500s, Weyer dared to claim that many so-called witches were simply mentally ill women in need of care, not execution. He wrote the prestigious Daemonum on the tricks of demons, arguing against the witch trials and defending the mad from the wrath of both church and mob. Unsurprisingly, the church was not thrilled. His books were banned and his ideas largely ignored. Meanwhile, madness remained a useful tool for those in power. Unwanted wives, political rivals, or rebellious daughters could be quietly declared insane and locked away. No trial, no scandal, just a convenient diagnosis. Mental illness was as much a social weapon as a medical mystery. Art and literature, however, blossomed with depictions of madness. Think Ophelia's drowning grief. Think Don Quixote tilting at windmills. The madman became a tragic, almost romantic figure, broken by the world, lost in illusion. But society still didn't know how to help them. The Renaissance reopened the body, reignited the mind. But the soul of psychiatric care still shackled, and the Age of Enlightenment was about to make that contradiction even sharper. The Enlightenment promised reason, progress, and the triumph of science over superstition. But when it came to mental illness, the results were mixed. On one hand, the idea of locking someone up for being possessed lost credibility. On the other, society now needed a new excuse to marginalize the mentally ill, preferably one with a white coat and a Latin vocabulary. The asylum, once a rare curiosity, became a booming institution. In London, Paris, and Vienna, grand buildings were constructed far from the city centers where the insane could be hidden. These places weren't hospitals, they were warehouses. Overflowing, understaffed, and reeking of neglect, they were designed less for treatment and more for isolation. The mentally ill were removed from public life, like broken furniture from a showroom floor. Ironically, this was framed as progress. French physician Philippe Pinel famously ordered the chains removed from inmates at the Bicêtre Asylum in 1793, a gesture widely hailed as revolutionary. But while symbolic, the reality was less idealistic. Patients might be unshackled, but they were still locked in, subjected to ice baths, forced feeding, and moral therapy, which often meant long lectures about proper behavior delivered by a stern-faced doctor with a stick. Moral treatment became the buzzword. The idea was that mental illness stemmed from bad habits, laziness, or moral failings. So what was the cure? Discipline, order, routine. No outbursts, no questioning. Think of it as a psychological boot camp with locked doors. Inmates were taught to follow rules, attend chapel, make their beds, and smile at authority. Compliance was considered recovery. In Britain, the York Retreat emerged as a gentler model. Run by Quakers, it emphasized kindness, silence, and natural surroundings. Patients walked in gardens and were treated with respect. This humane model influenced others, but remained the exception, not the rule. The real shift came in paperwork. For the first time, doctors began keeping detailed notes on mental patients, charting symptoms, behaviors, and even treatment outcomes. Psychiatry was inching toward being a formal science, though it still relied heavily on guesswork and anecdote. The Enlightenment made mental illness a subject of study instead of shame, but the cost was cold sterility. In its rush to rationalize everything, society reduced the mentally ill to specimens. Less demonic, yes, but still dehuman. Humanized, and on the horizon loomed a Victorian world obsessed with propriety and terrified of what lurked in the human mind. The Victorian era was the golden age of contradictions, elegance and repression, scientific breakthroughs and moral panic. And nowhere were those contradictions more glaring than in how the Victorians dealt with mental illness. For a society obsessed with appearances, madness was a terrifying crack in the porcelain for women. That crack had a name. Hysteria. Derived from the Greek word for uterus, the diagnosis became a catch-all explanation for anything women did that made men uncomfortable. Mood swings. Hysteria. Sexual desire. Hysteria. Not wanting to marry. You guessed it. Hysteria. It was a patriarchal dream. Pathologize independence, punish emotional expression, and call it science. The treatments were even more absurd. Some doctors recommended vibratory therapy, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. Others suggested marriage, childbirth, or bed rest. Dr. Ware Mitchell's infamous rest cure confined women to their beds for weeks. No reading, no conversation, no writing. Essentially mental solitary confinement with wallpaper. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper was a direct response, written after she nearly lost her mind under the same prescription. Meanwhile, in the male-dominated world of medicine, things got weirder. Jean-Martin Charcot, a neurologist in Paris, became famous for his dramatic demonstrations of hypnotized hysterics at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Crowds of male students and elite socialites gathered to watch women twitch and convulse on command. It was half science, half theater. Charcot believed he was advancing neurology. Critics called it exploitation. Sigmund Freud sat in those audiences, taking notes that would birth psychoanalysis years later. Victorian asylums became vast complexes, often surrounded by high walls and whispering trees. They were supposed to be places of healing, but too often they were dumping grounds for inconvenient people. Epileptics, alcoholics, rebellious daughters, elderly parents, or those simply suffering from grief. Once admitted, escape was nearly impossible. A single signature could have you institutionalized. Getting out that required several more in one. The public, meanwhile, kept up appearances. Madness became something to hide, not confront. Families lied about missing relatives. Obituaries emitted institutional deaths. Mental illness was a stain, a scandal, a threat to marriage prospects. The asylum was society's broom closet, and the goal wasn't treatment, it was invisibility. Victorian England perfected the art of hiding what it feared most. And buried beneath the corsets and canes was a nation quietly drowning in untreated minds. The 20th century began with bullets and barbed wire, and it forced the world to finally confront the mental toll of human suffering during World War I. Doctors were faced with something they couldn't exorcise, bleed, or hypnotize away. Men shaking uncontrollably, screaming at phantom gunfire, or rendered mute by terror. These weren't weaklings or madmen. These were soldiers, heroes broken by war. They called it shell shock. At first, the term was taken literally. Physicians assumed exploding artillery shells were damaging the brain with vibrations. But the real truth was harder to accept. The human mind had a limit. Trench warfare, with its ceaseless bombardment, death and mud-choked claustrophobia, had broken it. Officers who once laughed at nervous complaints now faced entire battalions suffering from amnesia, tremors, and night terrors. Some men couldn't walk. Others forgot their names. A few simply stared into space for days, unreachable. And yet, many commanders treated it as cowardice. Some British soldiers were executed for desertion, men who had, in fact, been driven insane by trauma. But slowly, attitudes shifted. Doctors like Rivers at Craiglockhart War Hospital began experimenting with new treatments, talking, writing, and empathetic listening. Rivers famously treated poet Siegfried Sassoon, encouraging him to express his trauma through verse. This was a quiet revolution. For the first time, mental illness wasn't framed as sin or weakness. It was a wound. After the war, shell shock became one of the most controversial terms in psychiatry. Some doctors tried to distance themselves from it, calling it a catch-all for everything from PTSD to malingering. Others recognized it as the birth of trauma psychology. But the public didn't forget. The war neuroses haunted the cultural imagination, broken soldiers shuffling through post-war Europe, eyes sunken, minds far from home. And when World War II arrived, the medical community was better prepared. This time the term was combat fatigue and treatment was faster, more humane, though stigma remained. Shell shock opened a new chapter. Mental illness was no longer just for women labeled hysterical or eccentric in asylums. It could strike the strongest men. It could be earned through service and sacrifice. And that terrified people. Because if war heroes could break, then maybe no one was truly safe from the battlefield inside the mind. As the world stumbled into the mid-20th century, psychiatry took a bold and often brutal leap into physical intervention. The idea was simple. If the mind was sick, perhaps the brain could be fixed directly. But fix is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. What followed was a wave of invasive procedures that promised miracles, but often delivered silence, obedience, or ruin. Enter the lobotomy. Developed by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in the 1930s, the procedure involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex to reduce agitation and delusions. It earned Moniz a Nobel Prize. But the real boom came when American psychiatrist Walter Freeman introduced the ice pick lobotomy. No operating room needed, just a mallet and a few minutes behind the eye socket. It was fast, cheap, and horrifying. Tens of thousands underwent the procedure in the U.S. alone, including children, housewives, and veterans. Some became docile. Others lost speech, motor function, or personality entirely. A few died on the table. Yet hospitals kept offering it because it emptied beds. A patient who had been violent or uncooperative was now quiet, vacant, manageable. Success by 1940s standards. Then came electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. While still used today in carefully controlled settings, its early applications were far from gentle. Doctors would administer jolts of electricity strong enough to induce seizures, often without anesthesia or consent. The goal? To reset the brain, like shaking a faulty light bulb. For some patients, particularly those with severe depression, it brought real relief. But for others, it caused memory loss, confusion, and trauma. This was the golden age of interventionist psychiatry, insulin coma therapy, hydrotherapy, isolation chambers. Doctors reached for any lever they could pull. Mental illness was treated like a broken machine, and the tools were crude. Compassion took a back seat to control. And still, asylums swelled. With the rise of state-run psychiatric hospitals, millions were institutionalized. Some stayed for decades, forgotten by families and society. The average person feared these places. Stories of abuse, neglect, and restraint leaked into tabloids and horror films. The mentally ill became monsters in pop culture, mad scientists, escape killers, the unhinged. The intentions were scientific, the outcomes often tragic. And as the 1960s approached, a new idea began to grow. Maybe it wasn't the patients who needed fixing. Maybe it was the system itself. By the 1960s, the tide was turning. Public trust in asylums had eroded. Investigative journalists exposed filthy wards, over-medicated patients, and inhumane conditions in state hospitals. Families stopped believing the promise of restorative care, and legislators started asking uncomfortable questions. Was institutionalization actually helping anyone, or was it simply warehousing the unwanted? Enter the movement known as deinstitutionalization. Fueled by three major forces: new medications, civil rights advocacy, and cost-cutting governments, the idea was simple. Close the big institutions and treat people in their communities instead. Antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine, introduced in the 1950s, made it possible to manage schizophrenia and other severe conditions outside the hospital. For the first time in centuries, the mentally ill could, at least in theory, live freely with pharmaceutical support. President John F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary had been lobotomized into near silence, became a vocal advocate for mental health reform. In 1963, he signed a bill funding hundreds of community mental health centers designed to offer outpatient care, housing support, and therapy. The goal? Independence, dignity, and reintegration. The closures began swiftly. Massive institutions that once held thousands were emptied within a decade. The image of the padded cell gave way to that of the neighborhood clinic. Patients were no longer confined, but encouraged to live in halfway houses with social workers checking in. On paper, it was a humanitarian triumph. In practice, it was chaotic. Why? Because the infrastructure never fully materialized. Many of the community clinics were underfunded, understaffed, or never built at all. Patients released from long-term institutions found themselves on the streets with nowhere to go. Families weren't prepared. Law enforcement wasn't trained. Suddenly, the burden shifted from medical professionals to social services, jails, and shelters. Homelessness rates rose. So did incarceration. A significant portion of the prison population began showing signs of untreated mental illness. Deinstitutionalization wasn't entirely a failure, but it became a cautionary tale. Compassion without preparation isn't a solution. It's just displacement. Still, the movement changed everything. It forced society to admit that locking people away indefinitely was not humane care. It brought mental illness into the public square, into conversations, policies, and eventually media. It laid the groundwork for patient rights, ethical treatment, and a more holistic approach. But for many, especially the poor and marginalized, the promise of dignified care remained just that, promise. Today, mental illness is no longer confined to asylums or dismissed as witchcraft, but that doesn't mean it's fully understood or even widely accepted. The 21st century has brought massive strides in neuroscience, psychology, and therapy. Yet stigma clings like a shadow. For all our scientific vocabulary, we still flinch at words like bipolar, schizophrenic, or borderline. Thanks to brain imaging, we now know that conditions like depression and anxiety aren't just in your head in the dismissive sense. They involve real, measurable changes in brain chemistry, structure, and function. Genetic research has linked certain disorders to hereditary factors, environmental trauma. Childhood neglect and even gut health are now recognized as contributors to mental instability. For the first time, we're beginning to see mental illness as a dynamic intersection of biology, psychology, and environment. But understanding doesn't always equal empathy. Social media has helped normalize conversations around mental health, especially among younger generations. Celebrities now talk openly about anxiety, therapy, and medication. Apps offer guided meditation, therapy sessions, and mood tracking. And yet, access to real treatment is still painfully unequal. Rural communities, low-income populations, and minorities often face insurmountable barriers to care. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry, though crucial in many respects, has also been criticized for overprescription, especially of antidepressants and stimulants. Some patients feel treated as checkboxes on a diagnostic form, briefly seen, quickly medicated, and rarely heard. Therapy, once stigmatized, is now a billion-dollar industry, but it's still out of reach for many, and old ghosts linger. Homeless populations are still disproportionately composed of those with untreated mental illnesses. Prisons now serve as the largest de facto mental health institutions in many countries. Emergency rooms are flooded with psychiatric crises they aren't equipped to handle. It's deinstitutionalization without the promised safety net again. Yet there are signs of hope. Trauma-informed care is gaining ground. Peer support programs are flourishing. Schools are beginning to integrate mental wellness into curriculums. Movements for neurodiversity challenge the notion of a single correct mind, and therapy is no longer whispered. It's recommended, but the work is far from done. Mental illness may no longer be chained to a wall or cut from the brain, but many still suffer in silence, buried under cultural shame and systemic failure. History has shown us what not to do. The future will be defined by whether we finally start doing better. Bushido, meaning the way of the warrior, was not a law written by emperors or carved into stone. It lived in the hearts of the samurai, whispered through generations, inked in poetry and sharpened into steel. It governed everything a warrior did, from how he fought to how he lived, and most importantly, how he died. Emerging during Japan's feudal era, Bushido evolved over centuries, drawing from a mixture of Shinto reverence, Buddhist calm, and Confucian discipline. It demanded 7 core virtues: loyalty, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and rectitude. These weren't vague ideals. They were life obligations. A samurai who violated one could expect social exile or a far more gruesome end. Loyalty wasn't negotiable. The samurai swore unwavering allegiance to his daimyo, his feudal lord. Betrayal wasn't seen as political treason. It was spiritual pollution. Even in defeat, a loyal retainer might choose death over dishonor. The concept of giri, an unrepayable sense of duty, bound him tighter than any contract. And death? That was never the enemy. The ideal samurai embraced it daily, preparing his soul for the moment when duty would demand the ultimate price. If he failed his master, displayed cowardice, or brought shame to his name, there was one way to reclaim dignity: seppuku. With stoic calm, he would plunge a blade into his abdomen and slice sideways, spilling both pain and guilt onto the tatami mat. A second, called the kaishakunin, would stand behind him, ready to deliver a clean beheading and spare him prolonged agony. To Westerners, this might sound horrific, but to the samurai, it was beautiful. A final poem written in blood. Bushido didn't die with his swords. Even after Japan modernized and the samurai class was dissolved, echoes of Bushido lingered. It shaped the ethos of Japanese military officers during World War II, and still lives on today in martial arts, business culture, and national pride. What makes Bushido extraordinary isn't just its severity. It's that it demanded honor, not just victory. But in restraint, humility, and even in death, the sword was sacred. But it was never the point. A true warrior under Bushido didn't just master combat, he mastered himself. And when the final moment came, he met death, not with fear, but with dignity. In the frostbitten lands of Scandinavia, the Viking warrior code was carved in fire and blood. It had no formal scripture, no single name like Bushido, but was etched into their sagas, their graves, and their gods. At its core was a stark belief: death comes for everyone, so die well. Viking honor revolved around bravery, loyalty, and reputation. The Norse didn't seek peaceful deaths in their beds. They sought battle. To fall with a weapon in hand was a dream, not a tragedy. Why? Because of Valhalla in Viking cosmology. Warriors who died courageously were chosen by the Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, to ascend to Valhalla, a warrior's paradise where they would feast, fight, and prepare for Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. But if you died a coward, your soul was cast into hell, a dreary underworld of shame. This belief shaped how Vikings lived. Raiding, pillaging, and conquest weren't just acts of survival. They were rites of glory. Cowardice wasn't just embarrassing, it was spiritually damning. To flee a battle was to stain your lineage. Even their funerals reflected this ethos. Warriors were buried with weapons, shields, even sacrificed horses or slaves, everything needed for the afterlife's endless war games. Loyalty to one's jarl or king was another pillar. Viking warriors, known as herdmen, formed tight-knit bands bound by oaths. Betrayal of the group was unthinkable, but that didn't mean blind obedience. Vikings valued personal honor as much as loyalty. If a leader lost face or made cowardly decisions, his men could challenge or even abandon him. Strength commanded loyalty. Weakness lost it. And vengeance, that was a virtue. If your kin was wronged or your honor insulted, you were expected to respond with steel. Feuds could last generations, spilling over into blood debts and cycles of retribution. It wasn't cruelty, it was balance. The sagas are filled with heroes who refused compensation or peace until justice was served blade to blade. Even in old age, many Vikings feared a quiet death more than pain. Some sought out danger in their final years, hoping to die in a glorious skirmish rather than waste away in bed. Anything was better than being forgotten, because for the Vikings, death was not the end. It was an audition for eternity, and only the brave made the cut. To be a Roman soldier was not simply to fight. It was to embody virtues, a word that blended virtue, valor, manliness, and civic duty into a single brutal code of conduct. A Roman warrior wasn't just a killer. He was a disciplined extension of the Republic or the Emperor's will, a walking symbol of order in a chaotic world. The ideal Roman warrior didn't crave individual glory. He earned honor by obeying orders, enduring pain, and never flinching in the face of death. Cowardice was unthinkable. A legionnaire who fled battle wasn't just punished, he was erased from respectability. In some cases, entire units were subjected to decimation. A horrific form of discipline where 1 in every 10 men was executed by their comrades to restore obedience. The Roman warrior code was built on structure. Training was constant, relentless, and grueling. Discipline was more important than strength. A soldier who broke ranks even in victory could face lashes or execution. Glory belonged to Rome, not the man. This collectivism set the Roman military apart from most ancient forces. It was less a band of warriors and more a machine. But virtues extended beyond the battlefield. It was a societal expectation for Roman men, especially those of noble birth, to show courage in the Senate, to be just in leadership, and to display restraint in personal matters. Personal ambition were also considered marks of warrior honor. Even retired soldiers were expected to carry themselves with dignity, as living monuments to Rome's greatness. One of the most sacred virtues in Roman military culture was fides, faith or loyalty. Loyalty to your unit, your commander, and to Rome itself. Betrayal, insubordination, or desertion were treated with utter contempt. Think of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It wasn't just a political act. It was a defiance of the warrior code's loyalty to the Republic. Death was not feared. Dying in battle, especially for Rome, was the highest honor. Tombstones of Roman soldiers often boasted of where and how they died, listing campaigns like a resume for the gods. Unlike the Vikings who sought personal glory in Valhalla or the samurai, who died for their lords, Romans fought for the enduring myth of civilization. They weren't just defending borders. They were exporting orders and enforcing it with spears. For the Roman warrior, the code was clear. Obey, endure, conquer, and die like a citizen of eternity. In medieval Europe, the warrior wasn't just a killer. He was supposed to be a Christian killer. Enter the code of chivalry, an unwritten romanticized set of ideals meant to tame the bloodlust of knights with the nobility of saints. At least that was the idea. The word chivalry comes from the French chevalier, meaning horsemen. And in a world where heavy cavalry ruled the battlefield, knights needed more than armor and swords. They needed a moral compass, or at least the church thought so. The chivalric code combined martial prowess with piety, loyalty, and yes, courtly love. A true knight was expected to be brave in battle, loyal to his liege, generous to the poor, and protective of women and the weak. He was to pray often, fight fairly, and never lie. Of course, this ideal existed mostly in literature and sermons. In practice, knights could be brutal warlords with a crucifix in one hand and a torch in the other. Still, the code had real influence. During the Crusades, for instance, knights were told they were not merely fighting for land or glory, but for God himself. Killing in battle wasn't a sin if it was done in the name of Christ. It was holy. The result? Some of the bloodiest campaigns in history wrapped in righteous rhetoric. Chivalry also demanded loyalty, fealty to one's lord. A knight swore oaths of service, often sealed on sacred relics. Betraying that oath was considered not just treason, but sacrilege. And when a knight broke the code, he wasn't just punished by men, he was believed to be judged by heaven. Then there was courtly love, the strangest part of the chivalric tradition. Knights were supposed to pine for noble ladies, usually married, and dedicate heroic deeds to their honor. Love was supposed to be chaste, poetic, and maddening. Basically, it gave violent men something to write about when they weren't beheading each other. Of course, chivalry didn't apply to peasants. Knights could sack villages, burn crops, and execute rebels without guilt, so long as it wasn't another noble's land. The code was selective, idealistic, and often hypocritical. But it created a powerful mythos that shaped European culture for centuries. The Knight's Code wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about justifying it. Chivalry turned warfare into ritual, loyalty into law, and honor into theater. If other warrior codes danced between honor and poetry, the Spartan Code came with no frills, no romance, just stone-hard discipline and absolute obedience. Sparta. The ancient Greek city-state built its identity on the idea that every male citizen was a soldier first and everything else second. In Sparta, war wasn't a profession, it was life itself. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his body was judged. If he was weak or deformed, he was discarded. If he passed inspection, he was handed over to the Agog, a state-run military training program that raised boys into lethal instruments of war. There was no room for softness, no room for doubt. The Agogs taught them to fight, steal, endure pain, and above all, obey without question. Spartan boys learned to speak in short, sharp phrases. Laconic wit, it was called. Talk less, do more. They were taught to sleep on reeds, wear minimal clothing in the cold, and go hungry without complaint. Courage wasn't just admired, it was mandatory. A Spartan who ran from battle wasn't just a disgrace. He was stripped of citizenship, scorned by women, and made a pariah. The ultimate commandment of the Spartan Code? Never return without your shield. That didn't mean don't lose it. It meant don't come back unless you're carrying it or being carried on it. In other words, win or die trying. Anything less was treason and loyalty. It ran so deep that Spartan soldiers would rather fall to the last man to break formation. The phalanx, their tightly packed battle line, required every warrior to hold the shield of the man next to him. Breaking formation meant exposing your brothers to death. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a moral collapse. The Spartan Code also expected total submission to the state. Spartans weren't free in the modern sense. Their lives were dictated by duty to Sparta, to the army, to the gods of war. Even marriage and family life were secondary. Wives encouraged their husbands to die gloriously. Mothers told their sons, come back with your shield or on it. In Sparta, the individual didn't matter. Glory didn't come from lone heroism, but from disappearing into the machine of war. Their strength was unity, their honor in sacrifice. And for centuries, no one dared challenge the phalanx, because Spartans didn't just fight like warriors, they lived like weapons. If the samurai lived by honor and the Spartans by discipline, the Mongol warrior lived by the cold clarity of results. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols built the largest contiguous empire in history, not through overwhelming numbers, but through speed, precision, and a ruthless warrior code that valued loyalty, adaptability, and total obedience. At the heart of this code was allegiance to the Khan. Mongol warriors swore personal loyalty to their commander, and breaking that bond was unthinkable. Betrayal was punished not just with death, but with obliteration. Genghis Khan made it clear loyalty ensured survival. Disobedience ensured extinction. Mongol discipline wasn't born in cities. It was forged in the brutal steppes of Central Asia. Nomadic life demanded toughness. From a young age, Mongol boys learned to ride horses, shoot bows, and survive with minimal supplies. A Mongol could go for days with no fire, live off dried meat and fermented milk, and shoot with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. That wasn't a skill. It was a cultural expectation. The Mongols didn't believe in individual glory. They operated as a single moving organism. Every warrior was expected to follow the Yasa, a codified set of laws attributed to Genghis Khan. These laws emphasized military discipline, meritocracy, and strict punishment. Looting without permission. Executed. Disobeying orders. Executed. Cowardice in battle. You guessed it. Executed. But they weren't mindless brutes. The Mongol code emphasized strategy over chaos. They mastered psychological warfare, often pretending to retreat only to ambush pursuing enemies. They spared cities that surrendered and annihilated those that resisted, sending a brutal message to others. Merit also played a key role. Unlike many medieval systems where birth mattered most, Mongol officers were promoted based on skill and loyalty, not noble bloodlines. If a peasant proved himself on the battlefield, he could rise through the ranks. In this way, the Mongol code was shockingly progressive for its time, rewarding competence over class. Perhaps the most terrifying part of their ethos? Detachment. Mongol warriors viewed war not as a moral conflict, but as an inevitability. Death wasn't personal. It was a tool. They didn't seek honor like knights or spiritual purification like samurai. They sought victory, and they almost always got it. The Mongol code wasn't romantic. It was efficient, mobile, and devastating. It made warriors not of marble or myth, but of blood, bone, and pure resolve. The warriors of the Zulu kingdom weren't forged in myth. They were trained by fire, sweat, and a revolutionary named Shaka Zulu. In the early 19th century, Shaka transformed a fragmented cluster of clans into a disciplined, militarized force that shook southern Africa to its core. At the center of it all was a warrior code grounded in unity, courage, and absolute loyalty to the king. Shaka introduced radical changes to Zulu warfare and to Zulu identity. He replaced the throwing spear with the Ikawa, a short stabbing spear ideal for close combat. He mandated the use of large cowhide shields and organized warriors into tightly knit regiments called impi, each living, training, and marching together like family. But this wasn't just tactical innovation, it was ideological transformation. The Zulu warrior was no longer a part-time fighter. He was a servant of the nation, a living shield. Warriors were grouped by age and trained in rigorous discipline from adolescence. They were forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in battle, a way to tie honor to service. The warrior didn't fight for individual glory, but for the survival and expansion of the Zulu people. Their bond was sacred, their formation unbreakable. Cowardice was not an option. To turn your back on the enemy or break ranks during a charge was a stain worse than death. Those who fled were executed publicly. Those who stood firm were celebrated, often with promotions, cattle, and prestige. Bravery was the currency of masculinity, and warriors were expected to give everything, including their lives, without hesitation. Loyalty to the king was absolute. Shaka ruled with charisma and terror, and his warriors revered him like a deity. Disobedience was met with swift, often fatal punishment, but in return the king cared for his impis, offering food, protection, and recognition. Zulu warfare emphasized not just strength, but psychology. Shaka's famous buffalo horn formation, with a chest, horns, and loins, allowed his forces to envelop enemies with terrifying precision. Every warrior had a place, and every death was part of a larger purpose. The Zulu warrior code turned a tribal society into a military state and ordinary men into legends. They didn't fight for conquest alone. They fought as one body, one heartbeat, one shield. And when the spears rose, even empires learned to tremble. Among the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest, the Apache warrior carved a legacy not through empires or grand armies, but through resilience, stealth, and a code of survival that defied conquest. For the Apache, warfare wasn't just a duty. It was a daily act of existence in a land that was as harsh as it was sacred. Unlike centralized warrior cultures, the Apache didn't organize around kings or empires. Their code wasn't written in law or dictated by generals. It was taught through oral tradition, lived experience, and necessity. In a world surrounded by hostile tribes, expanding settlers, and U.S. military campaigns, Apache warriors developed a combat philosophy built on mobility, precision, and endurance. At the heart of the Apache code was self-discipline. Boys were trained from an early age to endure pain, hunger, thirst, and silence. Running long distances barefoot, bathing in icy rivers, and fasting were all rites of passage. A true warrior needed more than a strong arm. He needed an iron will. He had to read the land like a book, track enemies by broken twigs, and vanish into cliffs without a sound. Silence was considered a virtue. Boasting was frowned upon. Actions spoke louder than words, and warriors who performed bravely in battle often received no outward reward, only the quiet respect of the tribe. Stealth and cunning were prized as much as bravery. The Apache didn't see ambushes or hit-and-run tactics as dishonorable. They saw them as smart. Loyalty to one's band and family was sacred. The Apache didn't fight for conquest. They fought for protection. Warriors were defenders of the homeland, guardians of the community. Retaliation for raids, broken treaties, or slain kin was not only expected, it was demanded. Yet vengeance was always measured. Recklessness had no place in their code, and when it came to resistance, few cultures endured more pressure. Leaders like Geronimo became symbols of unbroken defiance, leading guerrilla campaigns against overwhelming odds. Even when captured, exiled, or imprisoned, many Apache warriors refused to surrender spiritually. Their code had no room for submission. To the outside world, the Apache were often seen as savages. But within their culture, the warrior was a keeper of balance, common voice, sharp eye, deadly in motion. They weren't chasing glory. They were keeping the world intact. One silent step at a time in the heart of 17th century India, amid the clash of empires and the oppression of faiths, arose a warrior brotherhood unlike any other, the Khalsa, the Saint Soldiers of Sikhism. Formed by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699, the Khalsa wasn't just a fighting force. It was a moral revolution wrapped in armor, driven by a code that combined spiritual devotion with fearless resistance. The Sikh warrior code was revolutionary in two ways. First, it was egalitarian. The Khalsa rejected caste, wealth, and lineage. Every member took the same last name, Singh, meaning lion, to erase social divisions. A lowly farmer stood shoulder to shoulder with a prince. They fought not for conquest, but for justice, for the protection of the oppressed, regardless of religion or origin. Second, it demanded unshakable discipline. Upon initiation, Khalsa warriors vowed to uphold righteousness, never cut their hair, never engage in intoxication, and never harm the defenseless. They bore 5 symbols, the 5 Ks: Kesh, uncut hair; Kara, iron bracelet; Kanga, wooden comb; Kashara, shorts; and Kirpan, a ceremonial sword. Each carried spiritual meaning. But the Kirpan especially signified the duty to stand against tyranny. The code was built around the concept of Miri Pyri, a balance of temporal power and spiritual wisdom. A Khalsa warrior wasn't just a fighter. He was expected to meditate, serve others, and remain humble even in battle. Warfare was a last resort, never to be driven by ego or vengeance, but only to defend righteousness. Fighting was not about rage. It was about responsibility, and when they fought fiercely. Khalsa warriors stood against the powerful Mughal Empire, often outnumbered but never outwilled. Their battle cry wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of purpose. Betrayal of the code was rare because it was tied to one's very identity. To be Khalsa was not just a title, it was a vow, a sacred pact of courage, service, and self-sacrifice of the Sikh warrior. didn't fight for glory, land, or empire. He fought because it was his divine duty, and in doing so, the Khalsa forged a legacy of fearless equality that still inspires warriors of conscience to this day. Long before the first bottle was smashed or the first speakeasy opened its doors, America was already fighting a war against alcohol. By the late 1800s, the country's relationship with drinking had spiraled out of control. Booze wasn't just a pastime. It was a daily fixture. Saloons weren't merely watering holes. They were political clubs, gambling dens, and brothels. Public drunkenness was widespread, and many reformers pointed to alcohol as the root of domestic violence, poverty, and moral decay. Enter the temperance movement, a coalition of activists, church leaders, and political crusaders who saw alcohol not as a personal vice, but national crisis. One of the loudest voices came from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, whose members marched, picketed, and prayed outside saloons, urging men to give up their drink for the sake of their families. They were joined by the Anti-Saloon League, a group that didn't just protest, they played politics and they played to win. The Anti-Saloon League understood something critical. Laws change when you change lawmakers. So they lobbied hard, targeting local, state, and federal elections to get dry candidates into office. By the early 1900s, they had built an astonishingly effective political machine. They pressured politicians, funded campaigns, and used propaganda to paint alcohol as a threat to the American way of life. But there was more than morality behind the movement. There was fear and nationalism. Immigrant communities, especially Germans, Irish, and Italians, were often associated with heavy drinking. For many native-born Protestants, the saloon wasn't just a vice, it was a symbol of foreign influence and cultural division. As World War I broke out, anti-German sentiment surged, and beer, heavily associated with German-American brewers, became a target of patriotic disdain. The stage was set. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The following year, the Volstead Act was passed to enforce it. America was officially dry, but rather than usher in a golden age of sobriety and virtue, Prohibition would instead uncork something far more chaotic. Black markets, bootlegging, and bloodshed. The crusade had won the law, but the fight for the soul of a thirsty nation was just beginning. Prohibition might have started with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, but it was the Volstead Act that gave the law teeth and plenty of fine print. Named after Congressman Andrew Volstead, who championed its passage in Congress, the act defined what intoxicating liquor actually meant. Spoiler. It didn't just ban hard liquor, it banned anything with more than 0.5% alcohol content that included beer, wine, cider, even medicinal tonics. Suddenly, the ordinary became illegal. But as strict as the Volstead Act sounded, it was also riddled with loopholes, contradictions, and legal gymnastics that turned enforcement into a nightmare. For starters, Prohibition didn't make it illegal to drink alcohol. You could still drink it. You just couldn't sell it, transport it, or make it. That meant if you had a cellar full of wine or a few barrels of whiskey before the law kicked in, you were technically safe. Private stockpiling became a booming side hustle, and many wealthy Americans bought up entire inventories before the ban took effect. Then there were the religious exemptions. Wine for communion, still legal. Suddenly, churches, some real, some hastily fabricated, saw their membership skyrocket. Clergy found themselves in the unusual position of acting as both spiritual leaders and alcohol distributors. One priest joked that his congregation had grown miraculously overnight. Medical loopholes were even more absurd. Doctors could prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes, and pharmacies could legally dispense it. That led to an explosion of shady prescriptions and booming business for chains like Walgreens, which grew from 20 stores to over 500 during Prohibition. Bourbon for a cough? Brandy for your nerves? Step right up. Meanwhile, enforcement fell to the newly formed Prohibition Bureau, a severely underfunded and often corrupt agency that couldn't keep up. Many agents were either bribed, intimidated, or simply overwhelmed. Raids were inconsistent, penalties often lenient, and bootleggers were always a step ahead. The Volstead Act, in theory, was supposed to engineer a sober society through strict control. In practice, It created a tangled mess of gray zones, selective enforcement, and fertile ground for a booming underground economy. As the Volstead Act took effect and legal alcohol vanished from shelves, something else began to flourish in the shadows. The speakeasy. These illicit bars and nightclubs sprang up in basements, back rooms, and behind sliding walls in cities across America. The term speakeasy came from patrons being told to speak easy about their location, because if the wrong person overheard, the party might end in a police raid. But those raids? Rarely successful. Speakeasies weren't just hiding, they were protected. By the mid-1920s, there were tens of thousands of speakeasies in New York alone. Many operated in plain sight, bribing local officials and cops to look the other way. A raid might occur for show, but behind the scenes, cash change hands and doors reopened within hours. Inside, the scene was electric. Jazz bands played wild improvisations. Women in flapper dresses drank alongside men in tuxedos for the first time. Social mixing was part of the drinking culture. Speakeasies broke barriers between classes, between races, between genders. In many urban speakeasies, white patrons danced to black music, and women smoked, drank, and flirted openly. It was rebellious, glamorous, and intoxicating in every sense. But the booze? It was often questionable at best and deadly at worst. With legal distilleries shut down, bootleggers began manufacturing alcohol in hidden labs and bathtubs. This bathtub gin was often crude, unregulated, and spiked with dangerous chemicals to stretch supply. Blindness and poisoning were not uncommon. Still, the demand was so high people were willing to take the risk. Speakeasies were more than bars. They were symbols of defiance. They represented the failure of Prohibition to stamp out America's love affair with alcohol. The harder the government tried to enforce the ban, the more the public found creative ways around it. Hidden compartments, secret passwords, false storefronts. Prohibition turned ordinary citizens into everyday outlaws. In the process, nightlife transformed. Jazz culture exploded. Fashion changed. Even slang evolved, with terms like juice joint, giggle water, and bootleg becoming part of everyday speech. The speakeasy wasn't just a workaround. It was a cultural revolution in disguise. Prohibition had aimed to make America sober and righteous. Instead, it made the country sneakier, bolder, and infinitely more rebellious. As Prohibition pushed alcohol underground, organized crime stepped into the spotlight, armed, ambitious, and eager to supply what the government had banned, with booze illegal and demand skyrocketing. A black market economy was born, and at its heart were the gangsters who turned alcohol into a billion-dollar business. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in Chicago, where Al Capone became the face of the Prohibition underworld. Capone wasn't just a thug. He was a businessman, a strategist, and a public figure who provided jobs, ran soup kitchens, and bribed the police with pocket change. But behind the public image was a ruthless enforcer who ruled through violence, fear, and corruption. Capone's empire trafficked in thousands of gallons of illegal liquor, moving it through secret warehouses, armed convoys, and crooked speakeasies. He had entire neighborhoods under his thumb, judges, mayors, even law enforcement. And he wasn't alone. Across the country, cities like New York, Detroit, and Kansas City saw the rise of bootleg kings, Irish mobs, Sicilian mafias, and Jewish crime syndicates, all using Prohibition as their golden ticket. These criminal networks didn't just move alcohol, they professionalized crime. They created systems, hierarchies, and rules. Turf wars were common and blood spilled often. One of the most infamous events was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 members of a rival gang were lined up and gunned down in broad daylight. Allegedly on Capone's orders, the message was clear. This wasn't a small-time ST. Violence. This was organized warfare. Ironically, the more the federal government cracked down, the more sophisticated the criminals became. Smugglers used fast boats on the coasts and cars modified with hidden compartments inland. Some even built tunnels under the U.S.-Canada border to ferry in whiskey from Montreal. Others had insiders at distilleries still legally producing medical or industrial alcohol, which was then repurposed into bootleg spirits. Public sentiment began to shift. People questioned a law that seemed to breed more crime than it prevented. What began as a moral crusade was now enabling the rise of criminal empires more powerful and violent than anything the country had ever seen. While bootleggers and gangsters flourished in back alleys and secret warehouses, the federal government tried desperately to hold the line. Enter the Prohibition agents, or as they came to be known, the G-Men. Tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act, these men were supposed to be America's moral guardians, hunting down illegal liquor and bringing order to a nation gone rogue. But there was one problem. Almost everything was stacked against them when Prohibition began. There were fewer than 1,500 federal agents assigned to enforce it nationwide. That's one agent for every 70,000 people. These men were poorly trained, underpaid, and overwhelmed. And it didn't take long for corruption to seep in. With gangsters offering bribes that far outpaced a government paycheck, many agents looked the other way or actively participated in the very crimes they were hired to stop. Still, not all G-men were crooked. Some, like Elliot Ness, gained fame for their dedication. Ness led a team called the Untouchables, known for their refusal to take bribes and their relentless pursuit of Al Capone's empire. They smashed stills, raided warehouses, and tried to bring order to lawless Chicago. But even Ness couldn't bring Capone down through Prohibition law. That job eventually fell to the IRS, who nailed him for tax evasion, not bootlegging. Most enforcement efforts were clumsy at best and dangerous at worst. Raids were often tipped off in advance. Innocent people were sometimes caught in the chaos, and the black market just adapted. Bootleggers became masters of deception, changing routes, disguising shipments, and creating networks that moved faster than the law. The government even took a darker turn. In an attempt to stop people from drinking industrial alcohol used in bootlegging, federal officials ordered it poisoned. Thousands were sickened and hundreds died. The press called it government murder. Public opinion, already sour, turned bitter. All of this contributed to a growing sense that Prohibition was unenforceable and worse, unjust. Law-abiding citizens became criminals overnight, and real criminals became rich, powerful, and untouchable. While lawmakers tried to legislate morality and G-men chased bootleggers through alleys, American culture was undergoing a revolution of its own. Prohibition didn't just change the law, it changed the vibe. And in that chaotic, intoxicating space, new voices rose, new rhythms exploded, and a new kind of American identity emerged at the center of it all. Women. The very movement that pushed for Prohibition, led in large part by women's groups, had unintentionally opened a cultural door they couldn't close. With the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote just before Prohibition began, women suddenly had more political power, more visibility, and more freedom to redefine their roles in society. In the roaring cities, the image of the flapper was born. She smoked, she drank, she cut her hair short, danced in public, wore scandalous dresses that showed ankles and knees, and rejected the quiet submissiveness expected of previous generations. She wasn't just breaking social norms, she was obliterating them. And where did she go to express all this rebellion? The speakeasy, of course. There, women and men mixed freely. For many, this was the first time they could socialize as equals, sharing drinks and dancing shoulder to shoulder. The strict rules of Victorian etiquette melted under the heat of swing and saxophones. This was the Jazz Age, a cultural eruption that changed American music forever. Jazz was born in black communities in New Orleans, but spread through Prohibition like wildfire. It was loud, wild, improvisational, and unapologetically modern clubs like the Cotton Club in Harlem attracted white patrons eager to hear black musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, even as segregation remained outside the door. Alongside music, Prohibition inspired a literary boom. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the decadence, disillusionment, and booze-soaked chaos of the 1920s. The American dream was being rewritten in real time, with gin on the rocks. Even fashion shifted. Clothes became less restrictive, hairstyles shorter, morals looser. What had started as a movement to clean up society accidentally sparked a generation of people determined to break every rule. Prohibition didn't purify culture. It unleashed it in the vacuum created by repression, art, expression and rebellion thrived as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s. The United States was hit by an earthquake that shook every corner of society, the Great Depression. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and bread lines stretched for blocks. Amid this growing desperation, the grand moral crusade of Prohibition started to look less like virtue and more like a luxury the country could no longer afford. Suddenly, the idea of banning alcohol wasn't just inconvenient, it was economically devastating. Legalizing alcohol again meant potential jobs, tax revenue, and economic relief. Before Prohibition, alcohol taxes accounted for up to 30% of federal income. Now the government was broken, and so were the people. Repeal started to make more sense than ever, not just to the public, but to politicians. President Herbert Hoover, who called Prohibition a noble experiment, found himself increasingly out of step with the national mood. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency in 1932, he openly supported repeal as part of his New Deal platform. His victory was a turning point. Not just politically, but culturally, Americans were ready to drink legally again. The final blow came with the ratification of the 21st Amendment in December 1933, which officially repealed the 18th. For the first time in the U.S. history, a constitutional amendment was erased by another. Champagne corks popped from coast to coast. Bars reopened, breweries retooled. A great sigh of relief swept the nation. Not just because alcohol was legal again, but because a long national contradiction had finally ended. But the damage was already done. The black market that Prohibition created didn't disappear overnight. Organized crime had grown too strong, too rich, and too embedded in urban power structures to simply walk away. Gangsters who once ran bootlegging operations moved into gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. The federal government had created a monster, and killing it would take decades. Culturally, the era left scars and legends. Speakeasies, jazz, flappers, and gangsters became part of the American mythos. Prohibition had failed in its mission to sober the nation, but it succeeded in reshaping it entirely. Even after the cork was popped on Prohibition's official end in 1933, its legacy didn't just evaporate. The social, political, and criminal consequences of the era stuck around, and in many ways still echo through American life today. The most obvious impact? Organized crime didn't go away. It adapted. The bootlegging empires built during Prohibition gave rise to modern mafia syndicates. The smuggling routes, bribery systems, and networks of corruption had grown so sophisticated that criminal organizations simply shifted gears into narcotics, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering. The violence didn't disappear either. Prohibition had given crime families power, and they weren't giving it back. The era also transformed American law enforcement. The failure to control alcohol exposed how weak and fragmented the federal government's policing power truly was. In response, the FBI expanded, surveillance techniques were refined, and law enforcement became more centralized and professionalized. The modern American war on crime was born from the ashes of a failed war on liquor. On the political front, Prohibition revealed the dangers of legislating morality on a national scale. What started as a movement to uplift the moral character of the country turned into an exercise in hypocrisy and rebellion. Voters, especially in urban areas, learned that laws disconnected from public behavior are doomed. The experience left many Americans skeptical of future moral crusades and wary of politicians promising purity through policy. Then there was the cultural shift. Prohibition inadvertently sparked a broader distrust of government overreach. People resented being told how to live, drink, and socialize. The resentment would resurface in later decades, from anti-smoking campaigns to debates about drug legalization. The ghost of the Volstead Act haunts American culture every time there's a clash between law and lifestyle. Even the alcohol industry had to rebuild itself from the ground up. In the decades following repeal, regulations were introduced to control advertising, drinking ages, and distribution. To this day, liquor laws in the U.S. vary wildly from state to state, a messy legacy of the fractured Prohibition years. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. Prohibition taught Americans that banning something doesn't make it disappear. it just pushes it underground. Long after the last speakeasy closed and the final bootlegger faded into history, the Prohibition era found a second life, this time in pop culture. What had once been a decade of legal chaos and blood-soaked crime became a glittering myth of gangsters in pinstripe suits, jazz-filled clubs, and rebellious glamour. Prohibition didn't just leave behind laws, it left behind legends. Hollywood wasted no time. Films like Little Caesar 1931 or The Public Enemy 1931 turned bootleggers into icons. James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson didn't just play gangsters, they defined them. Al Capone was no longer just a criminal, he was a celebrity anti-hero. The lines between villain and folk hero blurred, and America fell in love with the very men the government had tried to erase. The trend continued through the decades. The Untouchables, Once Upon a Time in America, Boardwalk Empire, each retelling added more glamour, more grit, and more mythology to an era that had been, in reality, chaotic and often brutal. Speakeasies, once underground dens of questionable booze, were reimagined as classy lounges filled with swing music and Art Deco charm. Even the language of the time stuck. Words like bootleg, giggle water, juice, joint and hooch still crop up in retro bars and themed parties. The flapper look with its fringe dresses and bob hair remains a fashion staple in costume culture. In jazz, the soundtrack of rebellion during Prohibition became a defining symbol of American creativity. But it wasn't just entertainment. The Prohibition story became a moral parable, taught in schools, debated in political circles, and invoked every time a new movement tried to ban something. Whether it's cannabis laws, internet censorship, or dietary restrictions, critics often ask, are we repeating Prohibition? It also helped fuel the American fascination with the outlaw hero, the idea that when laws go too far, it's not just acceptable to break them, it's patriotic. This mindset, rooted in Prohibition's speakeasy culture, continues to shape attitudes toward authority and rebellion. In the end, Prohibition failed to make America sober, but it succeeded in making it legendary. It became a story not just about law and order, but about resistance, culture, and the power of unintended consequences.